Chapter 1541. The battlefield was already in a state of chaos. The sky in the north was burning fiercely, and there were streaks of dazzling black smoke hanging in the sky. Scornful Tast's mountain-like corpse crawled on the horizon. Its crystal-like body was covered with vines, and a hole filled with cracks pierced through its body. It quietly stared in front of it. There Valhalla's dim crown was slowly regaining its luster. The dazzling pillar of light was like a verdant dream, engraved in the memories of everyone who saw it. The roots of the giant tree were once again inserted into the ground, and the sparkling radiance of magic flowing under the plateau could be seen from dozens of miles away. However, Valhalla had almost withdrawn from the battle. The Crystal Cluster Lord's figure towered into the clouds on the other side of the giant tree, continuously attacking Valhalla's defenses. Every time it collided with the hemispherical net of light, the entire stronghold would shake intensely. The Valkyries had already taken to the sky, riding around Farah and attacking. However, from afar, it looked like a silver light spot beside an amethyst mountain. Tens of thousands of purple light formations suddenly appeared on Farah the Errant's huge body, and beams of purple light shot out from the formations. The Valkyries were instantly drowned in a sea of purple light, and some of them were hit and fell down from time to time. A silver arc suddenly pierced through the sea of purple light. Tulman had finally completed his spell, and the surface of the crystal within a radius of dozens of feet collapsed. Farah screamed in pain. Like a shock wave, the sea of crystal clusters within 1,000 meters of him shrank in unison. However, this was only a silhouette of the vast battlefield. Thick smoke and dust shrouded the entire battlefield. People had already lost contact with most of the troops, and the people on the battlefield could only fight on their own. Fortunately, the crystal cluster had also lost one of the 3 crystal towers. The White Lion Knight who had launched the attack had long been separated from each other. However, Freya still continued forward, moving in the direction of the other crystal tower in her memory. She was already injured all over, and she pushed away the corpse of a crystal cluster with difficulty. Amidst the cracking sounds, the sword in her hand also broke into several pieces. Freya raised her head with some difficulty. She could still see the scene of the battlefield in the sky. The crystal cluster, giant dragons, floating battleships, griffin knight and wyvern cavalry weaved in and out of the vast sky. However, the battlefield had already reached its most intense stage and no one could tell who was who. With an earth-shattering explosion, it was as if a sun had risen in the sky, and the bright light even lit up the layers of clouds. A huge black rhombus-shaped crystal was slowly falling through the clouds, slanting and crashing into the ground. Dazzling flashes kept bursting out from the surface of its rhombus crystal. Those were silver light spots that were crashing into the enormous body that looked like a floating city. And every light spot of light was a floating battleship. The Banksians, Aween, and Bugas resolutely carried out their tactics. Floating ships were gradually leaving the formation. Before they left, they fired their cannons to salute everyone. Then, in the blurry tears of the people, they streaked across the sky and let out a final flash. The Black King, Fitztom, who had been insufferably arrogant for 7 generations, had reached its end on this battlefield dominated by mortals. Above its gigantic body, there was an astonishingly large hole. The Silver Elf Lord, whose armor was in tatters, slowly stood up. He was the hero of this generation of the Silver Elves and had experienced countless battles. But here, perhaps this would be his final stop. He supported himself with one hand on the edge of Fitztom's broken surface. Facing the howling wind on the plateau, he took off his helmet and threw it far away. The helmet rolled and disappeared under the clouds. Silver blood flowed from his forehead. Norn wiped it with his hand, and there was also silver blood on his hand. His partner, his comrade for thousands of years, the corpse of the dragon beast lay quietly in the hole. That was the last glory of the Dragon King's cavalry. He pulled out his long sword and threw it down. The long sword drew an arc in the clouds, and gradually became a shining spot of light. The Dragon King's cavalry would never leave their weapons to the enemy, even after they died. Norn suddenly recalled the holy war thousands of years ago. He stood in the valley and watched his father and brother leave. The elves sang hymns and walked out of the valley where they were born and raised. Many of them never came back. That was the era when the light returned. That was also a great war since ancient times. Just like now. The light above the clouds disappeared. Freya slightly narrowed her eyes, which were fascinated by the dried blood. The sky returned to the color of blood. In the center of the sky there was a beautiful silver ring. But it was not a decoration. It was the battlefield between the King of Wizards, Solomon, and Harionov. The two strongest wizards in the world were going to compete in such a place at such a time. She looked at the beautiful silver ring and the countless crystal clusters that crashed into it, shattering into pieces and falling to the ground. Then she lowered her head, bent down to pick up another long sword and slowly walked forward. Smoke and dust covered the whole battlefield. But behind the smoke, the black sphere in the center of the battlefield became more and more obvious. A faint pressure surrounded the whole battlefield. A god was getting closer and closer to this world. Dragons flew over the battlefield from low altitude. They were beginning to gather from all directions. Mithril led the dragons to approach the transmission channel from another direction. The dragons had decided to stop it at all costs. The power of a god, even if it was no longer favored by the law of Tiamat, was not something that mortals could compete with. It was a level of power that was far above that of the King of Black, Fitstom. But a shadow was cast in front of Mithril. Arak the Invisible. A huge crystal wasp flapped its wings and flew in the sky, blocking the dragons. Vladimir the Great, who was once again defeated by Solomon, suddenly stopped. Although he looked a little embarrassed, with a scratch on his cheek, and even a piece of his red robe was burned, he looked at the dragons in the distance gloatingly and suddenly laughed. The King of Wizards is indeed the King of Wizards. Solomon, your era even overshadowed the light of all of us. People even think that you are the most powerful wizard in the history of the Bugas. Although I am a little jealous, I have to admit the truth. Vladimir the Great Harionov said in a cadence, you are indeed very strong, stronger than any of us. But unfortunately you still can't change anything. He raised his hands and said loudly, look around. No matter how strong you are, can you be stronger than the people of God? Solomon looked at this man quietly. A long time ago he, Sarander, Yuki and this man, the four of them had supported the Silver Alliance of that era. They had experienced the break with the Myurnas, joined forces to fight against the most powerful spellcaster in mortal history, Tumen, and worked together to establish the order of the continent for 1,000 years after the War of the Holy Saints. Since then, the Silver People had watched over the continent left by Martha in the sky. But to his sorrow, his old friends were drifting away from him. Yuki had broken with the others a long time ago and died in the Great Glacier. Although Sarander did not support the ideas of the Sisaldians, he was closer to the Red and Blue Alliance emotionally. And this man left. He was even further away from them. Vladimir the Great, Solomon said quietly. For the sake of the past, I don't want to kill you with my own hands. Bow to the Erewhon and the Wind Elves. At least people will remember the pride of the Sisaldians. This joke isn't funny, Solomon. You're going to ask me to apologize to some mortals? Vladimir the Great sneered. Do you know why others don't agree with your ideas? Because we are Bugas born to be high and mighty. No one is high and mighty, Vladimir the Great. Your power and mine come from Tiamat. Lady Martha's grace belongs to everyone in this world, not you and me. But that's what we deserve. Vladimir roared angrily, I worked tirelessly to learn the truth and knowledge of this world in order to obtain the power and status I have today. All of this is the result of our hard work. How can those mortals be on equal footing with us? Based on what you see now, Solomon replied. In this war the mortals shed no less blood than us, but they get much less than us. We owe them Vladimir the Great. You're crazy, Solomon. You're the crazy one. Solomon enunciated each word clearly. He slowly closed his eyes. I'll say it for the last time, Vladimir the Great, face your own mistakes. You know who should be responsible for this. The glory of the Sisaldians comes from reason and knowledge, not arrogance and conceit. Vladimir the Great sneered. What if I say no? Solomon opened his eyes at once. The majestic and indifferent silver eyes in his eyes were no longer there. What was left was a pair of eyes shining with golden light. It was as if they no longer belonged to a Bugas, but a pair of dragon's pupils. Vladimir the Great swallowed his last sentence in horror. Bloodline sanctification. The Sisaldian wizard leader screamed in horror. This is the power of existence, how can you touch this level? Solomon looked at him coldly. His mottled long hair turned snow-white in an instant. He only stretched out his hand and pointed. Vladimir the Great's expression froze at the last moment. He watched in horror as the eye of truth in his hand cracked and shattered, and then the silver lines of law around his body disappeared one by one. In the end, even his own sense of existence gradually faded. His body was like sand, disappearing with the wind. At the last moment of his death, Vladimir the Great suddenly thought of a word. The supreme law. Destruction. Solomon took one last look at the place where Vladimir the Great disappeared, sighed softly, closed his eyes, and did not open them again for a long time. Valhalla City was already in chaos. When the entire stronghold began to shake intensely again, Valhalla City was already in chaos. In the tree hall, Haruz staggered, and the crown on his head fell to the ground, rolling into the distance until a hand held it down and picked it up again. Haruz looked at the man in a daze. Count Audine walked over, handed the crown to him and said softly, "Your Majesty." Count Audine looked around and said with some emotion, "After the royal faction and Her Royal Highness became enemies, I haven't been here for a long time, but not much has changed after the battle with Ampere Seal. I still remember meeting Her Royal Highness and Count Tonagel here, and nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is the royal faction itself." He looked at Haruz kindly. "Of course you have also changed, Your Majesty. The late king must have been pleased with your growth in the underworld." Haruz held the crown in his hand and stood silently in place. He also thought of his father. That long time ago his childhood with his sister seemed to have faded a little. Austin raised his head and looked at the tree hall. Through the long glass-arched window he looked into the distance. There was Valhalla's lush green canopy and the cloudy horizon. Occasionally there would be a flash of lightning across the sky. Outside the walls of Valhalla Fortress, the huge figure of the High Lord Farah was fighting with the Valkyries, intertwining with silver-white lightning. After a moment he said softly, "Your Majesty, the royal faction has done many wrong things, but I still remember the era of the late king, and I still feel proud of that moment. We have lost a lot. Our former comrades have left us one by one. Some have died suddenly, some have gone on a different path. Now that I look back, the faces in my memory have disappeared one by one. All that is left is an old man like me who is struggling at death's door." "Count Audine," Haruz said softly, "that's none of your business. I understand your feelings for Erwin." Count Audine smiled, and there was a faint light in his eyes. "Your Majesty, please allow this old man to make a small contribution to the royal family of Covardo, so that at least 100 years later, when people remember the name of the royal faction, they will not just feel ashamed." He put a letter in front of Haruz. "News from the battlefield, the Bugas and the Dragons hope that we Erwin can spare some time to stop the descent of Kleiss, but we have just lost contact with the White Lion Knight, and even Miss Freya is missing." Haruz looked at the old count in a daze. Count Audine just stared at His Majesty with a determined look. Haruz silently lowered his head and finally nodded. Count Audine bowed, but in his heart, he recalled the first time he was made a knight. The oath he made under the sword was not broken in the end. In the captain's room of the flagship Akhenaten, Manrique quietly looked at the order handed to him by his first mate. He suddenly remembered Count Audine's somewhat ordinary face. Count Audine was not an important figure in the royal faction, compared to Makarov, compared to Fleetwood, compared to Everton, and even compared to Oberway, who had broken off with the royal faction. But when everyone left the sinking ship, when everyone was deserted, there were always some who still held on to their original beliefs. Because they missed the flash of the past. Manrique suddenly remembered his original intention of coming to Tonagel, and remembered the figure he would never forget. He nodded slightly and said, "Give them the fastest ship, and order the fleet to prepare for cover. Make sure everything is done well." The first mate nodded solemnly. Chapter 1542. On the platform of the tree, fast-sailing ships were docking. The Hazel craftsmen were busy with the final modification of these airships. Several White Lion Knight were selecting volunteers, but there were so many volunteers that the emergency passage from the lower level to the upper level was blocked. The young and brave Tonagel sailors were loudly refuting the officer's ridiculous conclusion. In the end, why didn't they choose them? "You're too young." "Sir, I just look young." "Sir, we only recruit soldiers here." No, I'm also a soldier. I used to be a cavalryman of the Southern Army. Look at the wound on my arm. It's from the First War of the Black Rose. Why do you Tonagel people look down on me?" The young Hazel craftsman looked at the shouting Erwin people, shook his head and returned to his post. The chief mate and the bosun stood beside the handsome young man with a sad face. The young man looked at them and said, "I've told you more than once how this anchoring device works. Its core component is this dimensional anchor. This is a dimensional anchor created by a Circle 13 spell. It can disrupt the teleportation effect. Do you know what a Circle 13 spell is?" Yes. The two men nodded. The young craftsman looked at them suspiciously. "In that case, you shouldn't delete the operation steps without permission. Whether it's magic or magical engineering, it's a serious matter. If we lose a ship because of your mistake, do you know how serious the problem is?" Yes. The two men replied, sweating profusely. "Do you really understand?" The young craftsman raised his delicate eyebrows. Yes, yes. The chief mate nodded again and again. But why can't we open the mechanical lock and activate the anchoring device at the same time? This can save us a lot of time. I mean, we're going to die anyway. Can't we just activate the spell? The young craftsman stared at the suspicious guy. The chief mate could only surrender. Your Excellency has the final say. Your Excellency has the final say. In short, the young man nodded with satisfaction. Do you all understand? Understood. The bosun elbowed his comrade and replied, in short, Your Excellency can rest assured and leave this thing to us. The young blacksmith furrowed his brows. His slightly curved eyebrows seemed to reveal a ha. You seem to have misunderstood something. Letting you learn how to operate this thing is just a precaution. Who said I was leaving? Can you operate this anchoring device well? But compared to the professionals, you are still far from. The first mate and the bosun looked at each other. But, sir, this ship is, what? Only you are allowed to be brave, but the Hazel people are cowards? He knocked on the Arcanitech device and made a hollow sound. If we can't get rid of that portal, the outcome will be the same even if I stay there. Rather than die at home, I'd rather die at the front lines. But, the first mate replied hesitantly, Your Excellency, you'll be more useful if you stay here. The young blacksmith didn't even lift his eyelids and replied, Then I can't do anything about it. This is the prophet's decision. You can raise objections to your commander. Are there any other questions? The first mate and the bosun looked at each other and could only shake their heads. No problem, no problem. The young man looked at the two and the corners of his mouth curled up as if he had won a victory. The bosun picked up the iron ball on the side and asked, Then what is this thing? A cannonball? This is a small anchoring device, the young blacksmith replied. It's equipped for the air cavalry. Its function and magic circle are not inferior to this large device, but the range of its influence is much smaller. In short, this thing needs to be close to a certain extent to be useful. Without protection, it's basically impossible for the air cavalry to enter the portal. So, holding it can only be regarded as a psychological comfort. The bosun held the thing in his hand and looked left and right. Finally he asked, Can we take it? As you wish, the young blacksmith replied. Although this thing is very precious, there are many of them here. The two of them nodded and took one each. Austin looked at the situation in the port from afar and suddenly felt a little relieved. Because this was such an era. People could generously die in order to protect everything. And this was such an heroine. At this moment, it was destined to shine in the long river of the past and the future. With a soft cracking sound, Freya came back to her senses. The sword in her hand had already penetrated the crystal corpse at some point in time. She coughed heavily and blood flowed down from the corner of her mouth. Strands of blood-soaked hair stuck to her forehead. She pulled back the long sword and actually knelt on the ground because of her unstable strength. Her vision turned black and a series of footsteps sounded. A small group of soldiers passed by her, but due to the smoke and dust, they could not find the Valkyrie of Erewhon. Freya suddenly felt something in her heart. A monotonous buzzing sound echoed above the sky. It was the sound of the magic engine of the fast-sailing ship. She subconsciously raised her head. In the blood-red sky, a few shining silver lines were piercing through the smoke and fog, cutting across the horizon in a straight line. Freya suddenly froze and opened her cracked lips slightly. A flame was shining in the sky. On the three intersecting horizontal lines, the main fleet of the Bugas and the Banksians had already set up a formation. The flames flickered again and a path of flames began to slowly extend forward in the sky. In the center was a small but brave fleet, 23 fast-sailing ships with tall silver sails. They moved forward against the wind, like 23 straight silver lines, straight into the clouds. That was the fleet of Erewhon. Under the bombardment of artillery that exploded like fireworks, the brilliant light reflected on the young faces. At this moment, what unfolded in front of them was not just a picture of a huge battlefield, but a colorful path. The path of fire and light extended forward in the sky. Silver Dragon Mithril also raised her slender neck. In her mercury-like eyes, there were flashes of light reflected. In this chaotic battlefield it was so dazzling. The silver sails broke through the layers of heavy encirclement, separated the smoke and fog. Erewhon came without hesitation. Accompanied by the dazzling light, pieces of light exploded, and the surging crystal clusters could not stop their advance. She suddenly let out a low groan. The dragons spread out in an instant and surrounded Arak the Formless in the center. At this moment the offensive and defensive positions seemed to have switched. Looking down from the sky, the 23 tiny spots of light were already approaching the huge black sphere. Solomon silently watched this scene from high up in the sky. He had no energy left to cast any more spells, but at this moment he felt the power of destiny. The mortals stood side by side, and the future of the entire world was connected to each other like never before. Everyone subconsciously looked up and stared at the silver flashes in the sky. Under the attack of the crystal clusters, the 6 outermost fast-sailing ships finally began to slowly fall. Then the other 7 ships. People clenched their fists, but suddenly 3 fast-sailing ships took the initiative to leave the main formation. They accelerated into the sea of crystal clusters. The cannons on both sides spewed out flashes of light, and in the blink of an eye, they were drowned by the sky full of crystal clusters. But just as the light in people's eyes disappeared, the whole sea of crystal clusters suddenly swelled, and a bright flash of light pierced out from it. A newborn sun hung above the clouds, its light scattered in all directions. Facing the light that did not dissipate for a long time, Count Audine walked up to the command platform. Amidst the violent winds, the remaining 7 speedboats had shakily approached their target. "Open the lock." Count Audine calmly gave the order. "Open the lock." Reports came from the remaining airships. "Report the distance." 720. There was the sound of steel twisting in the air. Under the siege of the crystal clusters, the Bonneville on the periphery unfortunately crashed into the Sandeca on the side. The 2 sailing ships broke in midair and fell to the ground with a long tail. "Take care, I wish you victory, long live Erwin." This was the last signal from the 2 ships. The target was in sight. Count Audine closed his eyes. 5 ships activated the anchoring device at the same time. 5 tiny light spots finally approached the edge of the black sphere. In the sky, in the floating fleet of the Erwin, the Banksians and the Bugas, everyone held their breath. Their eyes seemed to have reflected the dazzling light that bloomed when the 13th circle spatial spell was activated. On the other side of the battlefield, a tremor passed through Mithril's heart. The silver dragon lady turned around. On the battlefield, Freya looked up at the sky like a stone statue. Suddenly, a long tail swept out from the black sphere. It first hit Count Audine's ship, then the remaining 4 airships in succession. One by one they were shattered. The specks of light were extinguished, and the fragments that filled the sky fluttered down. In the dark temple, it was so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. Brando silently clenched the hilt of Odorfai's sword. Cleis, the Lady of the Dead Moon. 10,000 years ago she was the goddess of sleep and night, the protector of all undead creatures. She was the god of death, but she was also in charge of the priesthood of life because of the cycle of life and death. But not now. After the fall of Tiamat, the lady, along with most of the gods, became the puppet of the Twilight Dragon. At this moment, the 2 sides were standing on opposite sides of a clear line. They were enemies, not friends. Brando turned around and glanced at Andrique. The vampire lady looked away guiltily, but she still looked at her goddess on the throne with a complicated expression. She was once the protector of all undead. At that moment, Mephistopheles and she suddenly understood how the dragons felt. However, the goddess on the throne was very calm. Her eyes were as deep as the stars as she looked at everyone. She seemed to have exhausted all her strength before she slowly opened her mouth to say 3 words. "Kill me." With a clang, the machete in Andrique's hand fell to the ground. Cleis closed her eyes, but when she opened them again, there was only cold murderous intent left in her dark eyes. The huge black sphere was suspended motionlessly on the Karsuk plateau. It was as if nothing had happened. Everyone looked at the scene in a daze. The wreckage of the airship slowly drifted to the ground. The sky was unusually calm and even the fire had stopped. The 3 airships did not know whether to continue the attack or if the god had come to this world. Manrique touched his cheek and his palm was wet. Outside the porthole there was a black trail in the sky. Was it a sign of the arrival of the end of the world? There was a whining sound on the plateau. It was the sound of the retreat of the troops. No one could compete with a god. The tragedy of the Battle of Metz could not be repeated here. On the battlefield, the Banksians were the first to retreat, followed by the other countries on the Great Plains, followed by the Lion Men of Toquinen, and finally the Highland Knight. Bunide, the leader of the Highland Knight, wiped the sweat off his palms and looked at the 2 remaining crystal towers on the battlefield from afar. He sighed with regret. But he did not hesitate. He threw down the long sword in his hand and rode back. Behind him there was a silver wave. The Silver Elves and the Earth Legion were covering the retreat of the mortals. But in the tide of retreat, there was one person who was going against the flow. Freya slowly straightened her body and walked forward resolutely. A crystal worm in front of her parted the dust and pounced at her. She swung her sword backward, and the blade and the crystal worm's head split apart. But at the same time she was knocked away and fell heavily on the ground. Freya gritted her teeth and crawled up again. She wiped the blood off her forehead and walked forward, one step at a time. Beside her, some soldiers finally noticed the existence of the Valkyrie of Erewhon. They stopped and looked at the female knight who was going against the flow in surprise. The people stepped aside and let Freya pass through them. Outside Valhalla, Tullman, who was resting, suddenly stood up from the city wall in confusion. In the sky, Solomon opened his eyes again, and a trace of confusion flashed in his eyes. A breath had completely disappeared from the battlefield. The silver dragon lady turned over and dodged Arak's crystal spike. She let out a low-frequency cry, calling for her companions to reform the formation and begin to climb in order to occupy a more advantageous position to attack. 2 or 3 silver lights flashed on the ring on her claw. Mithril lowered her head. It was a message from 2 young dragons from the periphery of the battlefield. Disappeared? She was slightly stunned. Mithril stretched her wings and turned in the air to look at the center of the battlefield. But immediately, a trace of disbelief flashed in her silver eyes. In the sky there was still a faint pressure from Klyce. But the teleportation beacon had disappeared. In Valhalla, William opened the door and walked out. He looked up and his eyes were filled with confusion. The teleportation beacon had disappeared. What? Could it be that Erewhon's people had achieved their goal at the last moment? But they had not arrived. Wait, they had arrived. A flash of light flashed in the mind of the wizard leader. Chapter 1543. She staggered forward step by step, and the smoke finally parted in front of her. Freya coughed and looked up. She squinted her eyes and finally saw the wreckage of the airship in the distance. It was the Vitomir Count Audin's ship. There were many corpses scattered around the wreckage. Freya picked up a broken spear and used it to support her body as a form of self-defense. Then she slowly walked in the direction of the wreckage. But she had only taken a few steps when she kicked something under her feet. Freya looked down and found that it was a white lion medal. She stopped silently and bent down to pick up the medal. Looking up, a little further away, Count Audin's broken sword was lying in the sand, and the Count's ribbon was still hanging on the hilt. Freya looked at the sword quietly, then walked past it and continued to move forward. The air was filled with a burnt smell. The closer she got to the wreckage of the airship, the more debris there were on the ground. Some were equipment on the airship, some were personal belongings. Freya also saw some disgusting mutilated bodies, or the charred frame of the airship that was still burning. Then she saw the most complete corpse along the way. It was a bosun with a look of disbelief on his face. In his blood-stained palm, he seemed to be holding something tightly. Freya lowered her head, squatted down, and gently pried open the man's cold and stiff fingers, ready to dig out the thing. But it was at this time that a weak voice stopped her. "Don't move," Freya was shocked. She turned around and saw a hazel man covered in blood lying under a few twisted iron plates not far away. A curved steel bar pierced through the man's lung. He coughed, and the light in his eyes was so weak that it was almost invisible. Freya hurried to the man's side and subconsciously reached for her medicine box, but it was empty. Only then did she remember that she had used it all in the previous battle. She looked at the man apologetically and found that he was still a young man with a delicate and quiet face. "I'm sorry However, the young blacksmith shook his head at her and said weakly, "Close the lock first. Remember not to trigger the anchoring device." "What did you say?" Freya was slightly stunned. The man glanced at her and repeated in an almost inaudible voice, "Turn off the lock first. Don't trigger the anchoring device." Freya finally understood what he was talking about. "Is that a space anchoring device?" The young craftsman's gloomy eyes shone brightly as if he had just regained consciousness. "You know him?" Freya hurriedly took out her knight badge. "I'm Freya, a senior officer on Erewhon's side." "Very good." The young blacksmith's eyes flashed and he used all of his strength to ask, "Can you fly?" "What did you say?" "Let me ask you, can you fly?" He could only raise a finger with great effort. His slender finger weakly pointed to the sky. "Send it up there." "Me?" The young blacksmith nodded slightly. The light in his eyes was almost gone. Freya held his hand and asked in a low voice, "Tell me, what's your name?" "Kia Fiak Corporal." "You're a girl?" Freya looked at the man in surprise. Only an almost inaudible voice told her softly, "My home is in Hazel. Tell my mother. It hurts." The voice was fading. Freya put down the man's hand silently. She looked up and suddenly felt a little sour in her nose. Maybe, she replied softly, I think I can fly. The girl had already fallen asleep under her feet. 3 messages were sent to Mithril's ring at the same time. Do you remember the battle in the wilderness of 4 territories? Someone is attacking Claire's body. Stop her from teleporting a second time and escaping from the underworld of Helm. Solomon, William, and Tolman. A bright light flashed in the silver dragon lady's silver eyes. She suddenly spread her wings and dove down to avoid Arak's pursuit. At the same time she sent the same message to the communication crystal. What should I do? A moment later, a message flashed on the ring. Lady Mithril, come to my side. Freya? Mithril was slightly startled. A bright light suddenly appeared in her vision. The light disappeared in a flash. It was at the center of the Karsuk Highlands battlefield. The ring flashed again. I have a way to stop the teleportation. Mithril no longer hesitated. She immediately rolled and flew down. The tips of her wings drew 2 beautiful arcs in the sky. This elegant tactical movement immediately made the dragons understand her meaning. Kin of Gold, spread out the attack formation and cover me. The group of dragons let out a clear and long cry in unison, then scattered in all directions. On the battlefield in the distance, Freya held the silver ring high in her hand. She looked at the silver arc in the sky with gratification in her eyes. In just a moment, the dragon spread its wings and flew over her head. The female knight pressed down her long hair, turned around and chased after Mithril. The silver dragon lady flapped her wings and slowly landed on the ground. She then looked up at Mithril. Freya, why are you still here? Mithril asked doubtfully. Didn't you retreat with the others? You said you have a way to stop Claire's teleportation. Is that true? Freya nodded. This is the wreckage of Count Audine's airship. I found a spacetime anchor device on it. Spacetime anchor device? Mithril asked in surprise. Is it still intact? Freya opened her palm to reveal the intricate brass sphere in her hand. She looked at the silver dragon lady and said, I can guarantee that it's still intact. Even the lock is intact. Mithril's heart skipped a beat. Do you know how to use it? Freya nodded lightly. Amandina taught me how to use the Magitech device. Very well. The silver dragon lady's narrow eyes shone brightly. She nodded without hesitation. Get on my back. I'll send you to the center of the portal. She then put down one of her tails and wrapped the female knight on her back. Mithril turned her slender neck and looked at Freya. There's no saddle, so you'll have to make do with it. You can hold on to my scales. Don't be afraid, I won't feel any pain. Thank you, Mistress Mithril. Freya was not used to the dragon's jokes. She was a little restrained. Mithril nodded and said seriously, this should be a small spacetime anchor device. We have to pass through the outer area of the portal. It's filled with spatial turbulence. I can protect you for a moment with my magic, but my mana is limited. We only have one chance. Do you understand? Freya nodded slowly. It's good that you understand. Mithril looked at her with satisfaction. She then flapped her wings and slowly left the ground. After circling a few times in the air, she began to climb higher. Above their heads was a huge black sphere. It was like a low-hanging dark cloud that shrouded the entire battlefield. Countless crystal clusters circled below the black sphere like a flock of ravens, protecting the portal. Freya looked at the ground one last time, then clenched the bronze sphere in her hand. The human and dragon soared straight into the clouds, and the silver dragon lady let loose a series of low-frequency roars from deep within her throat. These low dragon roars could be transmitted to an area over 100 kilometers away, but only the giant dragons could hear them. She was giving orders to the dragons. Kin of Gold, stay close to me. Stop Arak from approaching. The dragons roared as they descended. On the other side of the battlefield, the High Lord of the Crystal Clusters, Arak, had just noticed the strange movement in this direction through his complex crystal eyes. But from the corner of his eyes, he saw dozens of shining light spots suddenly descending from the clouds. Gold dragons. On Mithril's back, Freya also picked up her communication crystal. She paused for a moment, then softly said, This is Freya, Grand Commander of the White Lion Knight Order. This is Freya, I'm Grand Commander of the White Lion Knight Order. On the Tanajal's flagship, the Akhenaten, everyone in the captain's room was strangely quiet. Manrique slowly put down the commander's sword in his hand. He turned his head and quietly looked at the communication crystal ball that was making a sound. I repeat, this is Freya, I'm Grand Commander of the White Lion Knight Order. In the main battleships of the Buga and Banksians, on every communication crystal ball in every communication room, the same voice was conveying the same message to everyone. In estimated 3 minutes, Silver Dragon Lady Mithril and I will arrive at the target location and send the anchoring device into the portal. I request cover. I repeat, I request cover. On the Banksian's Glory of the Empire, Count Gonzalez slowly turned around. On the Akhenaten, Manrique had already put on his captain's cape and hat. He picked up his communication crystal, took a deep breath, and gave the order word by word. All fleets, listen up. Turn to the 6 o'clock direction and prepare to deploy the battle line with the Eagle as the reference. In the sky above, the 3 floating fleets that were slowly retreating from the battlefield stopped one by one. Countless floating battleships began to turn around in mid-air, but when they formed 3 lines on the battlefield again, the roar of cannon fire once again resounded through the sky of Karsuk. Iron and fire fell from the sky, and the light of the explosion lit up the entire plateau. This sudden explosion attracted the attention of every soldier on the plateau. Everyone stopped in their tracks and turned around in confusion. Didn't they already start to retreat? Where did the cannon fire come from? Who were the fleets attacking? Fiery sparks exploded in the sky. Under everyone's gazes, the Silver Dragon Lady spread open her wings and weaved through the cannon fire. She was as graceful as a fluttering butterfly. And everyone finally noticed the slender figure on the back of the butterfly. Suddenly there was a burst of cheers on the battlefield. The thunderous cheers came from the direction of Oween's people, but soon, it swept across the entire plateau. Valkyrie. Miss Valkyrie. Why is she there? What happened? Everyone looked at the scene in midair in shock, and in their vision, the tiny light spot finally approached the edge of the black ball of light. At that moment, everyone clenched their fists, and the White Lion Knight could not help but close their eyes. Everyone was afraid that history would repeat itself. After all, that was their commander, the heroic lady from Erewhon. But a miracle happened. Amidst the continuous flames and crystal cluster Lord Arak's angry roar, the tiny silver light spot suddenly accelerated at the last moment and plunged into the black ball. The battlefield was completely silent. But everyone subconsciously raised the sword in their hand. The tip of the sword pointed to the sky, as if a bright forest had risen. Forewarned. It was a silent cry. In the endless darkness, Freya finally saw the scene in front of her. The boundary between heaven and earth had disappeared, and in the pitch-black void, there were gravel wreckage of floating battleships, shattered crystal clusters, and even human corpses. Violent spatial storms blew from all directions, sweeping everything from the Karsuk Plateau into the depths of the black hole. The space was so vast, and in the center of the black hole, a tall woman like a giant was looking at them coldly. Kleis stood in the center of the void, her wild long hair fluttering in the wind. Half of her body was still under the black hole, and the other half was struggling to support the world. Her weapon, the pitch-black bladed whip called Fafnir's Fong, was tightly held in her hand. The Valkyrie subconsciously held her breath. That was a true god. Mithril seemed to feel Freya's nervousness and comforted her. Be careful, we only have one chance. Freya came back to her senses and nodded firmly. She bit her lips so hard that it almost bled. Kleis glared at the 2 insects that broke into her territory, but she seemed to be hesitant and did not make a move. The Silver Dragon Lady understood at a glance that Kleis was probably dealing with the intruders that attacked her body, and had no time to care about other things. This was the best chance for them. Freya, she whispered, the good news is that Kleis is distracted. I'm going to cut into the inner ring of the spatial storm, be ready? Freya nodded slowly. The Silver Dragon Lady suddenly let out a long howl, spread her wings, and changed direction to cut towards Kleis. At this moment, the vicious goddess finally could not take it anymore. She suddenly straightened her body, raised the whip in her hand, and swung it in their direction. However, Mithril was already prepared for this. She turned her body slightly and the huge whip passed by her body. A terrifying soul energy swept past the 2 of them. Freya felt that she was going to die immediately, as if her soul was going to fly out of her body. The Silver Dragon Lady saw this and shouted, "Don't mind that thing, it's soul essence." But just as she was distracted, she felt a sharp pain in her left eye, and suddenly she lost her vision on one side forever. The Silver Dragon Lady let out a shrill scream, but she still insisted on turning around and protecting Freya behind her. "Lady Mithril, are you okay?" Freya shouted in the wind. "I'm fine." Mithril endured the pain and replied, "Freya, get ready." The whip finally passed by the 2 of them. And now, Mithril flipped her body in the air. Freya only saw a bright light in front of her, and Kleis' huge face appeared in her vision. But at this moment, the female knight's heart was extremely calm. She immediately unlocked the spatial anchor device and activated the spell on it. For Erwin. Forewarned. Freya shouted and used all her strength to throw the brass ball out. Kia, please protect us. The brass ball slowly slid to the center of the void and time slowed down as if it had stopped. But the next moment, Freya only heard a shrill sound as if the sky was falling, and a dazzling white light hit her. Her eyes widened and then her eyes rolled back and she lost all consciousness. Kleist screamed and fell back on her throne. When her eyes regained their clarity, she lowered her head and quietly looked at the holy sword Odorfice that was stabbed into her chest. She looked at the golden blood slowly seeping out from under her robe, and a trace of peace appeared on her face. Well done, children. She looked at Andrique and Mephistopheles with gentle eyes and said softly. Andrique looked at this scene in a daze. Her mouth was open but she couldn't say a word. Mephistopheles came up from behind and silently covered his sister's eyes with his hand. He turned his head away and didn't say a word. Brando quietly looked at the dying god. Goddess? But Kleist gently shook her head. There are no more gods in this world and we are just ghosts that wander here, living like walking corpses. Perhaps death is the true release. She smiled and even had the mood to joke with Brando. Only the holy sword can hurt me. You came here with it, perhaps it is the choice of fate. Brando kept silent. She was the blessed of death for countless years, shrouding this world with sleep and night. Although she was the god of the dead, she symbolized the hope of life. She stood in front of the gate of Eladner's divine kingdom with a scythe in her hand, protecting the dead who came here to find eternal sleep. She was the goddess of the dead moon, and her divine kingdom was the peaceful home of all the dead. But she had lost her favor and perhaps the gods were long gone. Mephistopheles tightly pursed his lips and looked up. Andrique sobbed in a low voice. Kleist's gaze was very calm. She looked at Brando and said softly, Many years ago, I had foreseen the arrival of this day. I saw your face in countless years, so why have you come? Me. Brando was silent for a moment and then quietly replied, I have come to end everything. What is the end of everything? Brando didn't answer this question but asked in return, Goddess, what caused the gods to leave this world? Who defeated you? The goddess smiled lightly and her eyes showed weakness. You have already guessed, haven't you? Brando was silent. He turned his head and saw the same worry in the little female dragon's eyes. The gods created them and abandoned them, but in the end they died because of them and an era came to an end. He who was standing here represented another part of this plan. But did the gods and the people of the gods foresee their ending? Brando looked at the sword in his hand and for a moment he was a little confused. The goddess gently closed her eyelids. She said softly, Child, this is a debt but also a hope. Without bronze there would be no black iron. Kleist's body finally turned into light dust, and slowly floated from her throne, and finally disappeared. Just like that, a god left this world forever in her god kingdom. Andrique finally sobbed and fell on her brother's shoulder, crying bitterly. Only a low sobbing sound could be heard in the darkness. After a moment, Scarlet asked in a low voice, My lord, who caused the gods to leave this world? Who defeated Kleist and the other gods and made our era lose the glory of the gods? It was the Bronze Clan. How is that possible? The Highlander girl's eyes widened. It was the monsters that killed the gods. It was the Godslayer, Brando said softly. I should have known that the owner of this name was the Bronze Clan. The gods created the Bronze generation and abandoned them. The Bronze Clan who held a grudge turned to dusk, but betrayed again because all they wanted was revenge. He turned around and asked, Do you know the legend of the Eternal One? Except for the little female dragon Alaz, everyone shook their heads. Brando looked at them and replied, Because it is an existence beyond the gods, a perfect product, an eternal and immortal creature in this world. How can there be such an existence? Irene asked in confusion, Then isn't it dusk? Brendel shook his head, Because it is the ultimate existence of another plan, the ultimate weapon that the divine citizens will use to fight against dusk. It is the pinnacle of the Bronze tribe, but I didn't manage to guess its identity even though the hint was so obvious. What is it? Medisha asked. The little female dragon Alaz took 2 steps forward and came to Tia's side. And the light ball in the little girl's hand, the straight light was pointing towards the dome of the holy sanctum. Brando's gaze followed the light, 2 world tree roots intertwined with each other above the dome, and disappeared into the darkness and fog. Do you see it? Brando replied, It is there, where the world tree roots converge in the lower realm, the pinnacle of this world, the Emerald Summit. Medisha gasped softly. She suddenly looked up and said in disbelief, "Is it the Eternal One, the Eternal Dragon, the Emerald Dragon Nidhogg?" Brando nodded slowly. In the depths of the darkness, the merchant girl's eyes had a faint smile, staring at a spot of light in the distance, and there was Ilyodanur's divine kingdom. Behind her, the roar of the wind was becoming more and more deafening, and the sea of the netherworld suddenly surged with raging waves, washing away the foundation of the world, as if the entire world was about to be torn apart by these waves. It was like the death knell of the entire world, echoing in the depths of the void, and in the darkness of chaos, a behemoth was slowly awakening. As its consciousness awakened, the entire world's crystal wall let out a fragmenting sound. Then a golden eye slowly opened. It had finally awakened. The Roman laughed softly, and the laughter echoed in the darkness and the silent fog. Chapter 1544. When Freya woke up from her drowsy state, she struggled to blink her eyes. In her blurry vision, the first thing she saw was a blood-red sky. Her vision gradually enlarged. Pillars of smoke were hanging at the edge of the sky. Crystal clusters flew overhead, and occasionally one or two flames lit up the dark sky in the east. The light of the stars had already appeared in the sky. The stars twinkled in the lavender sky in the east. Occasionally a bright flash would explode in the sky. It was either a battleship firing or a crash landing. Then she saw the Silver Dragon Lady looking at her with concern. The Silver Dragon Lady's left eye was tightly shut, and silver blood kept flowing out of it. Freya was dazed for a moment before she finally remembered what had happened. She asked in a hoarse voice, "Lady Mithril, your eye?" Mithril shook her head, indicating that she was fine. "I'm sorry," Freya said softly. "That's not your fault," Mithril replied. "You've done well enough." "Did we succeed?" Mithril nodded solemnly. Freya felt dizzy with happiness. She looked at the golden red clouds in a daze. The light of the setting sun seemed to burn the entire sky. After a while, she regained her strength and asked softly, "Did we win?" "We won part of it," Mithril replied. "Part of it?" The Silver Dragon Lady moved aside silently, allowing Freya to see the other side of the sky. Above the golden clouds, the center of the battlefield was calm. The huge portal had disappeared. Freya's gaze was fixed, and her snow-white cheeks gradually climbed up her cheeks. At some point, a golden flame was reflected in her brown eyes. It was a bright golden line. It lay quietly in the sky, spewing out endless flames. It was slowly opening. Freya finally saw what it was. It was an opening eye, a golden red eye with a vertical pupil. It was above the sky, overlooking the earth. The flame-like clouds hung low, and countless meteors were slowly descending from the clouds, falling to the ground. It was a gigantic dragon that spanned across heaven and earth. It was dusk. Freya opened her mouth slightly and said hoarsely, "It's awake. Yes, it's awake." The Silver Dragon Lady also looked in that direction. A layer of fire was reflected in her silver eyes as she replied softly, "After an era, the nightmare of our world has once again descended upon this land. Is it all over?" "No, we still have hope." "Oh." The Silver Dragon Lady held Freya's hand and replied, "Have you forgotten, Freya? Our battle is over, but another battle has just begun." Valkyrie suddenly quieted down. She listened quietly to the sound of her heartbeat, steady and strong. That was his war. This was an ancient and verdant dream. When Brando stopped and looked at the crystal forest in front of him, such a thought appeared in his mind. Crystal clusters stood in great numbers, emitting emerald light. They sparkled with each other, and sacred ancient trees surrounded the area, forming a peaceful holy land. He looked up. Above his head, countless world tree roots rose from the darkness and mist, intertwining with each other and converging here, forming the base of a giant tree. The Jadeite Summit was a term used to describe this place countless years ago. It was the peak of the mortal realm, connected to the country of mist, the country of death, and the scorching river. In the previous life, the players had found the entrance to this place from the scorching river. And this place was the lair of the most powerful being in this world, the verdant dragon. Although its name was verdant, Nidhogg was a genuine black dragon. The reason it got its name was because of its holy blood, which was as green as jade. Brando only realized now that it wasn't because Nidhogg was special, but because it was a bronze dragon. Because that blood was bronze blood. He also understood why Nidhogg hid here for thousands of years and gnawed on the foundation of the world tree endlessly. The ambiguous background story in the Amber Sword finally turned into a clear answer here. Because the verdant dragon's purpose here was the throne of destiny. Eternal time did not dissolve its hatred for the gods. It wanted revenge for everything that Martha had created, and it wanted to completely destroy the world that she had protected with her own hands. Brando just never dreamed that the invincible world boss in the Amber Sword, after everything ended, would return to its original goal in this world. He still came here. He looked at this place and there seemed to be a strange feeling in his heart, a connection from another world. The souls of countless people were tied together with him. But whether he really had to face the eternal dragon, Brando was not sure. Everyone carefully moved forward in the crystal forest, and everyone was cautious not to speak. After all, the owner of this place was a mythical existence. His subordinate, Garm the Vicious Hound, was a notorious existence in the Divine War, not to mention the master himself. Of course, no one would expect the owner to be hospitable. The forest was quiet. Tia and Hippamera tilted their heads and looked at the reflections on the crystal bark, which could actually reflect their faces. It was just that on the divided mirror the reflections were big and small, and some were distorted exaggeratedly. Tia was shocked, and Miss Priestess had an interesting look on her face. Apart from the two of them who still had the mind to pay attention to these details, the others looked more or less serious. I finally understand. The Shire finally couldn't help but speak, and he whispered to Mephistopheles, "Why the bronze dragon appeared here, so their boss is here." Mephistopheles nodded, indicating that he agreed. And the dear demoness Helene walked at the front of the group. She had been alone in the darkness for thousands of years, and was the most suitable to adapt to the solitude here. Moreover, the crystal forest was kind of like home to her. She looked around and said, "This place doesn't look like it has been broken in by outsiders." "You mean we have already rushed ahead of the dusk?" Alaz asked. "That's hard to say," Helene replied. "The road to the Emerald Summit is not only the kingdom of the dead. I remember the legend said that Nidhogg himself arrived here from the world of ice and snow in the kingdom of mist. But at least we can't see the corpses of the dusk species here, right?" The Shire continued, "And most importantly, it means that we are not on the same path as the Emerald Dragon. You may not believe it, but this is a big relief." Brando looked back at Tia. The elven girl was still holding the light ball in her hand, and the light on the light ball was pointing straight ahead. Although he had never been to this place in person, he had seen a lot of related videos and quickly figured out where it was. If he remembered correctly, there were a few world tree roots in front of them, and the gap between the roots formed a huge valley. The players called it the Altar Valley because there was a square conical altar in the middle of the valley. When Brando thought of the altar, he had a vague guess in his heart. Sure enough, it did not take long for them to walk out of the crystal forest. The view in front of them suddenly opened up, and a beautiful valley jumped into their vision. Everyone could not help but stop. The valley in the distance was actually a sea of grass, dotted with crystal forests far and near. A waterfall fell from the world tree root, and after flowing through the entire valley, it poured into a sparkling lake on the horizon. Tia saw this scene and was so surprised that her mouth was wide open. She was not the only one. In fact, if they did not see it with their own eyes, no one would believe that there was such a beautiful place in such a lower world. Only Brando had expected this, and so he saw the tall altar in the valley at a glance. It was a pyramid-shaped altar that stood in the sea of grass. The whole thing was made of obsidian, and so it was very conspicuous in the green field. Brando noticed that the black main body of the altar was covered with a dense crystal grid. He had seen many of these things in the Deadly Frost Forest and the Loop of Trade Winds, and he knew at a glance that this thing could not be separated from the network of Tiamat. Brando walked forward, but behind him, Scarlet asked worriedly, "Will the Emerald Dragon be here?" Brando shook his head. He was not particularly worried about this. Although the Emerald Summit was Nidhogg's lair, the Emerald Dragon did not always stay in this place. More often than not, it was above the world tree gnawing at the foundation of the law of Tiamat, and often only returned to its lair to rest for a few times a year. Of course, the explanation in The Amber Sword was that players could only challenge the Dragon of Eternity for a few times a year, if there was really someone who came to challenge it. So Brando explained to the Highlander girl, "Nidhogg has been fighting with the law of Tiamat for a long time, and always fought until it was covered in bruises, and only then would it return to the Emerald Summit to rest. This kind of battle has been going on for thousands of years, almost endless, so it would not be long before it returned to the Emerald Summit." "But I don't understand," Scarlet frowned. "Why would it do that?" "Naturally, it's because of their hatred of the gods." Alaz continued, "The Bronze Tribe hates everything created by the gods, including our world itself. The sad thing is," the little female dragon continued, "even if it represents eternity, it can't bite through the foundation of the law of Tiamat, so for it, this battle is destined to go on forever." "What a sad fate," The Shire shrugged. As they talked, they had reached the edge of the altar. Brando raised his head and looked at the tall altar. The light on the light ball in Tia's hand was almost connected to the altar. Looks like we're here. The Shire saw the light and said, "What should we do next?" "Who has the Lionheart sword?" Brando asked. "It's with me," Medisha quickly replied. She lowered her head and was about to reach for the Lionheart sword hanging on her waist, but at this time, the whole valley suddenly trembled slightly. At that moment, everyone subconsciously stopped what they were doing. Tia was so scared that she immediately ran behind her sister. Everyone else raised their weapons, but Brando looked around carefully and found that after the sudden tremor, there seemed to be no abnormality in the valley. The tremor is coming from above. Irene looked up cautiously and pointed at the top of her head. "It's not close to here. It should be the Emerald Dragon." Brando thought for a moment and replied, "It may be attacking the World Tree." Tia was shocked. She stuck out her little tongue and asked in surprise, "It's not close to us, but it can still make such a big commotion? How big is it?" "Of course it's not small," Brendel replied. "It's a perfect existence after all. It holds the only eternal element in the world of Vaunt. The Emerald Dragon is defined as existing in countless parallel worlds and times at the same time. Even if it dies in a certain place at a certain moment, it will be revived because of its existence in another place at another moment." "My lord, does that mean we can't kill it?" "That's why it's called immortal." Brando nodded and replied, "In the other plan of the gods, it was originally used as the ultimate weapon against the Twilight. But things are unpredictable. Perhaps they didn't expect that what they created with their own hands would be such a disaster." "Against me?" Suddenly a sneer came from the valley. Brando looked up abruptly. That voice, it was the voice that described the deepest nightmares in his heart countless times in the middle of the night, the voice that woke him up time and time again. That was Roman's voice. Everyone turned around and saw the merchant lady slowly walking out from the sea of grass. She looked at the others and smiled. "Nidhogg is only fit to be a watchdog. How can its power be called eternal? Brando, in front of you, the so-called King of Bronze, is not even worth mentioning." Brando looked at Roman quietly. He looked at the girl who escaped from Butchie with him and Freya and dreamed of being a merchant. She had a faint smile on her face as if everything that happened 6 years ago was just a dream. And the promise he made to this girl in the past had become his biggest regret today. He said quietly, "Twilight Dragon, since you are controlling this body as enemies, I hope we can at least respect you." The smile on Roman's face gradually disappeared. She looked at Brando. "If it wasn't to completely destroy your world, why would I come here? All of this is because of that damned woman. If she hadn't thrown Tiamat into the chaos, I could have easily reduced you to dust." A voice rang out. "At the end of the day, it's because you are just a consciousness born from the chaos. Twilight, although you are powerful, you cannot represent this world." A figure walked out from behind the Highlander girl. It was Ovina. She looked coldly at the Twilight and said, "If you hadn't started that battle, why would we have come to this world? But it doesn't matter. The war that has lasted for generations will come to an end. And that moment will be the moment you lose." "Azure," Roman glared hatefully at Ovina, "our debt will be settled sooner or later." Just as she finished speaking, the entire valley suddenly shook violently again. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads because they could clearly feel that the source of the tremors this time was much closer than the previous one. The Twilight Dragon also looked up at the dome of the World Tree and smiled. "It seems that Nidhogg has already sensed your presence." Meh. Brando frowned. "Do you still not understand?" The Twilight Dragon's smile was eerie. "Nidhogg exists in every space and time. This is the so-called eternity. But there is a law in this world that can lock down every space and time. It is destined to counter this so-called eternity. Do you think it won't sense it?" Brando suddenly understood. Wasn't his element of time and space the greatest nemesis of the Emerald Dragon? But what made his expression change was that the Twilight Dragon said that Nidhogg had already noticed his presence. Didn't that mean that it was hurrying towards the Emerald Peak? It was at this time that the Jadeite summit shook for the third time. The shaking was so violent that Tia bumped into her sister. The others also lost their footing and looked up instinctively. This time, everyone could clearly feel that a giant creature had arrived above them. "What a good show," the merchant girl smiled and looked at each of them with her hands behind her back. "But I'm afraid I don't have much time to waste here. Brando, don't you want to see your little lover?" Brando was slightly stunned, and a bad premonition suddenly flashed in his heart. The Roman raised her hand and snapped her fingers gently. A person gradually appeared behind her. Who else could it be but Amandina? Everyone saw that Amandina's expression was blank. She was obviously under the control of a spell. Miss Amandina? Medisha couldn't help but call out in a low voice. Brendel's eyes were burning with anger. He stretched out his hand, and the holy sword Odorfice appeared in his hand almost instantly. His figure moved, and without thinking he stabbed towards the Twilight Dragon with flash strike sword art. But the Roman didn't move. The space in front of her bent slightly, and a giant crystal claw dozens of feet tall appeared out of thin air, blocking Brando's attack with a clang. The merchant girl calmly pulled out the sword in her hand and placed the blade on the motionless Amandina's neck. She said leisurely, "Why are you worried about your little lover? Have you forgotten that I'm the real mistress of the Abbeys? I'm your fiancé, dear Brando." Brando gritted his teeth and looked at her, taking a step back. Chapter 1545. The sky outside the window was already dark red. Golden meteors fell from the clouds from time to time and crashed into the ground. On the highlands, flashes of fire could be seen from far and near. It was already late, but the battle was still going on. In the northern sky, the floating fleet and dragons were still fighting against Iraq the Formless. After losing almost all of their top combatants, the battle had turned into a bitter war of attrition. Delphine gently put down the quill in her hand and stared blankly out of the window with her chin propped on her hand. Terrified screams could be heard from time to time. At this moment even Valhalla Fortress was in chaos. She turned her purple eyes slightly and looked in another direction. Below the fortress, Falafel the Errant was already on the verge of collapse. However, the number of Valkyries that flew up to fight was decreasing. Only the shining silver fire in the darkness was still the center of the battle. The Prime Minister's daughter was silent for a moment. Crick. The door behind her opened. She turned around and saw Mithril knocking on the door and coming in. The Silver Dragon Lady had changed into a clean robe, but her face was still pale. She rejected the goodwill of the people and simply washed her injured eye. Mithril stood in front of Delphine. The Prime Minister's daughter also looked up. The two in the room looked at each other in silence. "I heard that you were here," Mithril said softly. "I thought you would go with him." "Your eye?" Delphine asked. Mithril shook her head, indicating that she was not in the way. Delphine was silent for a moment. She picked up the quill again and scribbled something on the paper. But Mithril looked at Delphine's hand and said softly, "You are afraid, right?" Delphine's quill stopped. "Everyone will be afraid." She deliberately looked at the golden-red sky outside the window and smiled. "I'm not extraordinary. But what you are afraid of is different from others, isn't it?" The Silver Dragon Lady said. Delphine, "No." The Prime Minister's daughter shook her head. "There is no difference." She lowered her head, flipped open a page of the document and signed it. But Mithril looked at her quietly and said, "It's upside down." "What?" Delphine was stunned and raised her head. Mithril pointed at the document in her hands and said, "You're holding it upside down." Delphine's hand paused and the quill fell on the paper. She stood rooted to the ground, her mind in a mess. The wind was quiet, and the crystal trees in the valley emitted a faint fluorescent light. The light gathered together as if it could light up the darkness of the entire underground world. The jadeite mountain peak was like a lighthouse emitting endless light in the kingdom of the dead, standing tall in the darkness and fog. There was another dull rumble. The gigantic creature was getting closer and closer above their heads. Dust and ice chips were falling from the crisscrossing roots of the world tree in the mist. Brando quietly looked at the blade on Amandina's neck. He looked at Romain and asked coldly, "Twilight Dragon, what do you want?" "What do I want? I just want Miss Amandina to do me a small favor. If it weren't for her connection with the Lionheart sword, it would have taken me a lot of effort to find this place." The Roman smiled happily. "And there's more to come." As soon as she finished speaking, a silver dagger suddenly appeared in Amandina's hand. Before Brando could react, she raised the dagger and stabbed it into her own chest without hesitation. Crimson blood instantly soaked through the layers of clothes and spurted out. Brando could hardly believe his eyes. "Twilight Dragon!" Brando shouted furiously, and punched the giant crystal claw in front of the Roman. The claw's owner, the crystal tyrant Estoni, appeared behind the Roman and was almost sent flying by the punch. Brando did not care about anything else. He flashed to Amandina's side and caught the falling Amandina with both hands. The Roman had no intention of stopping him. Instead, she stood aside and watched the scene with interest. She walked to Estoni's side, held the crystal tyrant's claw, and jumped up with small steps. The crystal tyrant stood up and walked past Brando. Its huge body made the valley tremble slightly with every step it took. Brando did not even look at them. He only carefully poured the holy water into Amandina's mouth. Amandina choked and coughed. She opened her eyes, and her dark eyes finally regained their clarity. When she saw Brando, tears flowed down her cheeks. "My lord." Brando was about to speak, but he suddenly froze. Because he saw the dagger in Amandina's chest rising up by itself. Although the wound on Amandina's chest was healing under the effect of the holy water, the blood in the blood was still floating. However, the blood on the dagger was floating around. Droplets of blood flew out from the dagger and floated in midair. The countless droplets of blood seemed to have lost their gravity and flew into the sky. They merged with each other and formed a fist-sized blood ball. And within this blood ball, there was a faint golden light. Brando stared at this scene in a daze. He suddenly felt a throbbing in his heart. It was the resonance of the law of Tiamat. And it was at this moment that the Emerald Summit shook again. Shock waves came from outside the valley, followed by a deafening roar. Amandina was also stunned. She almost thought that she had seen wrongly. She asked with a pale face, My blood is glowing?" Not far away, the Roman sat on Estoni's claw and also looked up at the blood ball that was radiating golden light. She held the edge of the claw with both hands and kicked her feet. She sighed and said, "The blood of the sage, you hit it so well, Martha." At this moment, Tia's scream came from afar. "Help, this ball of light is moving on its own. I can't hold it anymore." Beside the elven girl, Andrea was the first to turn around and quickly grab the ball of light in Tia's hand. But it was at this moment that the light on the ball of light suddenly became incomparably dazzling. The vampire felt as if her hand was being burned by the light, and she immediately screamed and shrank back. It was at this moment that the ball of light suddenly left Tia's hand and flew into the air. Medisha instinctively stabbed her spear in that direction, but the ball of light seemed to have a consciousness of its own and avoided the attack. On the other side, Irene was chanting and summoned countless vines from the ground to block the ball of light in the air. But before they could get close, they were burned to ashes by the light of the ball of light. And just when everyone was caught off guard, Medisha suddenly heard a soft buzzing sound. She looked down and was surprised to find that the Lionheart sword hanging at her waist was vibrating slightly. A moment later, the sword of King Eric unsheathed itself and floated in the air. A drop of golden blood separated from the sword and flew into the distant sky. The ball of blood, the ball of light, and the drop of golden blood met above the valley and violently collided with each other before fusing into one. At that moment, the entire valley seemed to resonate with the grass and crystallized trees trembling at the same time. A golden light hung down from the world tree above and shot into the ball of light. And as the ball of light shone brightly, it suddenly came to the altar in the middle of the valley and slowly opened a door of light. Looking at the door of light, the Roman's eyes finally revealed a scorching light. She almost immediately stood up from Estoni's claw. "Stop her." Seeing this scene, Brando immediately shouted, "That's not her real body, prioritize attacking the Crystal King Estoni." But in fact, there was no need for him to give the order. The spear in Medisha's hand had already flown out, but the Crystal King raised its hand and blocked the spear. On the other side, Ropar and Irene had already blocked in front of Estoni. The Shire even used magic to create a barrier, but with just one punch from Estoni, Ropar and Irene could only retreat and the barrier was shattered. Brando saw this and picked up the blade of golden flames, gently putting it down. Amandina was about to join the battle, but Amandina grabbed his hand. She seemed to have finally regained her senses and said anxiously, "My lord, go save Miss Yuta." "Yuta?" Brando was stunned. What happened to her? "She's still outside." "She's outside?" Estoni stepped forward step by step, but the Roman sitting on its palms sneered at the people in front of her and said sarcastically, "Look at whose sword this is." As she spoke, she hooked the long sword in her hand and threw it down high. The long sword spun and fell, stabbing into the soft ground. Only then did everyone see that the long sword was Yuta's sword, the Fire Raven's tongue. At this moment, the ground suddenly shook violently, and the entire Emerald Peak seemed to be about to collapse. Everyone's expression changed drastically. The weaker ones, such as the Nightsong Tiger and Falerne, lost their footing and fell directly to the ground. Brando subconsciously turned around. Outside the valley, a huge head slowly walked in from there. What kind of creature was that? It was just a head, but it occupied a corner of the valley. Even the towering crystal tyrant Estoni paled in comparison to this dragon. Yes, it was a dragon. To be exact, it was a black dragon. However, under the black scales that covered its entire body, there seemed to be green flames burning. The flames seeped out from under the scales and fell to the ground. In an instant, they formed a cluster of emerald green crystals. As it slowly moved forward, the crystals flowed into a forest. Every step it took was enough to shake the entire valley. The way it strode forward with its head held high made people feel small and insignificant, as if it had the bearing of a king. Its huge head looked down at everyone condescendingly. Its black eyeballs were like solidified lava balls, looking at everyone in the valley with a look of contempt. But its gaze was mainly on Brando. Brando felt his scalp tingle. There was no doubt that this was the king of the Bronze Tribe, the God Slayer, the verdant dragon, Nidhogg. Nidhogg's black eyeballs seemed to contain a green flame, but there was no gentleness in them. When it saw Brando, the look in its eyes became colder. Brando lowered his head and saw the thing under Nidhogg's claws. It was a crystal prism, and in the prism the female mercenary captain was sealed motionlessly. Brando turned his head back angrily. He did not need to think to know whose masterpiece this was. Romaine smiled at him sweetly as if she was very satisfied with this prank. At this time Medicia's telepathic message came immediately, "My lord, we will stop the Twilight Dragon. You go and save Miss Yuta. The portal in the middle of the valley is shrinking, you must hurry." Brando looked in that direction and nodded silently. He understood that this was the only way. Brando stood up, and the verdant dragon Nidhogg immediately roared in his direction. At that moment, it was as if the whole valley shook. But Brando only glanced at it and disappeared from its sight in a flash. When he reappeared, he was already above the dragon's head. Brando pulled out the shallow sea holy sword Cinna in midair. With Odorfice in one hand and Cinna in the other, he jumped down heavily and stabbed the two swords into Nidhogg's head. Nidhogg let out a blood-curdling scream. Green flames immediately spread out from the wound and scattered in all directions. Nidhogg's sword had left a deep wound on the dragon's forehead, and it was so deep that the dragon's bones could be seen. But the verdant dragon immediately lowered its head, turned around, and swept its huge tail towards Brando like a mountain. The huge shadow rushed towards him. Brando put away the holy sword Odorfice with one hand, and with the other hand holding Cinna, he directly launched the glacier attack. A glacier dozens of miles long spread forward. The icy wind whistled, and the 10,000-year-old ice almost froze half of Nidhogg's tail and the back half of his body into an ice sculpture. And the remaining power of Cinna continued to move forward, turning a piece of the emerald forest into ice shards in the distance. As far as the eye could see, it was as if an endless glacier had appeared in the darkness. The freezing effect caused the verdant dragon to pause for a moment. Brando finally found an opportunity to flip down under the dragon's claws, and grab the crystal that sealed Yuta. With a spatial teleportation he teleported far away in the direction of the Shire. But in the next moment the glacier suddenly cracked, and Nidhogg took the opportunity to claw down at Brando. Although Nidhogg looked huge and clumsy, the claw was so fast that it almost left a shadow. Brando had to rely on his ability to control time to barely see the attack's trajectory. He lunged forward to avoid the fatal blow. But what made him a little creeped out was that this damn thing did not even use the elemental laws, and it actually tore a crack in space with brute force. He clearly saw the black spots brought by the claw, which were the signs of space breaking. What kind of monster is this? After his successful attack, Brando immediately took a step back, and Howran Gaia appeared in his right hand. He reversed the tip of the sword and stabbed it into the ground, and the ability of the Frost Earth Guard instantly burst out. Combined with the glacier created by the shallow sea sword, the stable power of the earth surged out from the ground, and two strong walls entwined with different law networks rose from the ground, separating him from Nidhogg. At this moment the Shire's voice sounded, "My lord, Miss Yuta is safe, retreat quickly." Chapter 1546. However, before the Shire could finish his sentence, his voice suddenly became urgent. "Be careful, Miss Medicia." Brando turned around just in time to see the silver elf princess groaning in pain and kneeling on the ground. Behind her, a silver figure was gradually revealing itself. Brando recognized the other party at a glance. It was Cyril, the king of the No race. Cyril's right hand had turned into a spear and pierced into Medicia's back. Fortunately, the silver elf princess had managed to avoid the fatal blow to her heart at the last moment. Otherwise, this blow alone would have been enough to kill her. Medicia covered her mouth with her hand, silver blood gushing out from between her fingers. Behind her, Cyril's left hand turned into a long sword and slashed towards her neck. However, a silver card fell from the sky, and Hippamera shouted, "Protection him." This spell, transformed from Enroldo's holy ring, turned into a silver arc of light and blocked Cyril's attack. The priestess reached out and grasped, and the figure of a spirit sword appeared in her hand. She took a step forward and stabbed at the monster. Cyril didn't care about Hipamra's attack at first, but when the blue-green sword pierced his arm, the king of the no race screamed in pain and retreated at lightning speed. Hipamra didn't chase after him and stepped in front of Medisha. Cyril looked at the burning wound on his hand with a gloomy expression, and raised his head with a twisted expression. The power of a planeswalker. Hipamra looked at the other with a serious expression. As a spirit sword, other than being able to raise her own strength by a level, she also had the ability to reverse green and reverse sapphire. To the laws of this world, green was life and blue was magic. She whispered, "Magic creature, you are a no race." "He is the king of the no race." Brando's voice sounded through the spiritual connection, transmitted to everyone. Cyril, the king of the no race. At this moment, the Twilight Dragon had already arrived beside the light gate. She turned around and looked at everyone with a smile. "My 2 commanders and a Nidhogg. Brando, defeat them and then talk about competing with me for the throne of destiny." In front of her, Astoni and Cyril, the kings of the Crystal Cluster and no race, stood before everyone like 2 mountains. Astoni was Leviathan's first avatar in the chaos, and could also be said to be Leviathan's first heir. Cyril's origin was even more mysterious. He was a consciousness born from chaos, and could be said to be essentially no different from the Twilight Dragon. He was a pure magical creature, and as long as there was a trace of energy he would be immortal. Nidhogg, who was in the distance, finally noticed the Twilight Dragon. Its eyes were filled with the same hatred as it growled in its direction. The Roman glanced at Nidhogg and smiled. "Nidhogg, both of you are part of Martha's and the Divine Folk's plans. Since he used to be my watchdog, I've sent him to you." As she spoke, she turned around and slowly walked into the light gate. The Shire, Falerne and Irene cast their spells at the same time. Endrique, Mephistopheles and Alaz also split up and flanked Astoni. Malurcha summoned the Shiny Fairies and the Centipede of Death. The Shire used a card to immobilize Cyril's mobility at the same time. The Crystal Cluster Tyrant Astoni only raised its hand to block, and the spell still hit its body. Before the lines of law could reach its body, all of them disappeared. Alaz saw this and reminded everyone, "Be careful, this guy is immune to spells." And with a shake of its huge body, countless crystal cluster fragments fell from its majestic body. As soon as these crystal cluster fragments fell to the ground, they turned into crystal cluster lords, entangling Endrique, Mephistopheles and Alaz's attacks. The effect of the magic imprisonment ended in an instant, and the King of the No was finally able to break free from its restrained state. As soon as it attacked, Hipamra was immediately injured. After all, it was a creature that had been on par with the gods for several eras. It lacked the power of divinity or the high-level authority in the law of Tiamat, so it was difficult to really cause them harm. Seeing this, Brando could only withdraw his hand from the battle with the Emerald Dragon. From a distance of thousands of feet, a silver line of law hit Cyril, and the King of the No was sent flying with a scream. But he also paid the price for this attack. Nidhogg roared, and a claw almost slammed him into the ground. The Twilight Dragon stopped at the edge of the light gate for a moment. She turned around and took one last look at everyone. She raised her eyebrows slightly, and with the habitual action of the merchant lady, stepped into the light gate. And the moment she stepped into the light gate, the entire Emerald Summit began to buzz. Medisha, who was recuperating, looked up and could not help but be shocked. "Oh no, the altar where the portal is located is the cornerstone of the Emerald Summit, and now it's going to collapse." The Shire and Alaz heard this and their hearts sank at the same time. They looked up and saw that the light gate in the distance had shrunk in size by half. The young wizard immediately cast a telepathic communication spell, and brought everyone into the temporary communication range. "My lord," his slightly calm voice rang out once more. Brando had just climbed out of the ground, and at the same time he dodged the Emerald Dragon's tail attack. The tail that was like the root of the world tree swept over the valley, causing the entire valley to almost break apart, revealing the roots of the world tree in the west. It even made a hole in the valley, and the majestic lake water was pouring into the dark abyss in the distance, making a roaring sound. In just a short moment, this tranquil valley had disappeared without a trace. The Shire's voice continued in the telepathic communication. "My lord, we will send you into the light gate." After Brando put some distance between them, he asked, "What are you going to do?" "There's no time for us to clean up these monsters one by one," the Shire replied. "The only way is for us to open up the extreme planes and pull Astoni and Cyril into our law." Medisha's weak voice also sounded. "My lord, we can't hold on for too long, you may only have a sliver of time." Brando did not say a word. But he understood the danger. For the master of the extreme planes, Pulling an enemy that he could not fight into his law was a battle of life and death. Just like Williams in the past, taking the initiative to open up the extreme plains to delay a strong enemy was often a last resort. Another voice sounded. No, leave Cyril to us. We only need Miss Alas to delay him for a moment. It was Ovina who spoke. The soul of the Holy Spear of the Sky Dome said seriously, I can help Scarlet open all of the seals of the Sky Dome and temporarily raise her power to the level of the Sky Dome, but Scarlet held her hand. Let me, Miss Ovina. Alas and Flora did not speak again. Success or failure depends on this, the Shire's voice said. My lord. Brando did not say a word. His gaze swept across everyone in the distance. The Shire, Medisha, and Mephistopheles all gave him smiling looks. Yes, success or failure depended on this. Nidhogg is in your hands, my lord, Medisha's voice said gently in his mind. Brando nodded slowly. Come, the Shire said loudly. Hippamera, lend me a hand. He reached out and a light blue card of fate appeared in his hand. Backtrack flash, instant spell, copy all the spell cards in the target's hand and add them to the target's hand. The blue card was pointed at Hippamera. At the same time, Miss Priestess found her hymn. The light of the silver card enveloped everyone. Cyril was surprised to see the hand that had transformed into a spear stabbing into Tia, but it shattered like real mercury on the little elf's shoulder. Tia was almost stunned by this attack. Medisha saw this and also showed her card. Pure White Barrier high-level spiritual chi spell. All of her creatures were bestowed with the power of the curtains at the same time, so they couldn't be targeted by any magic spells. For Cyril, who had mastered many different types of magic abilities and was a magical creature, it was as if half of his powers had been instantly crippled. Then the Silver Elf Princess showed another card. Void Mark. Every time you cast a barrier spell, summon an army of elemental archangels into the field. She then cast the White City flag, adding a powerful buff to every ally on the field. Everyone's strength almost instantly increased by a full 10%. A door of light opened in the sky, and countless white archangels descended from the sky, fighting with Astoni's crystal army. At the same time, Astoni's giant fist landed on the Shire, and a similar silver light blocked all the damage. The mage smiled and calmly summoned his extreme planes. In the distance, Brando drank bottle after bottle of holy water, constantly converting his flame of life into elemental power through rebirth and nirvana, and adding it to the elemental pool. And under the combined efforts of 7 or 8 planeswalker creatures, his elemental pool was only decreasing, not increasing. Brando steeled himself and simply activated his unyielding ability, directly doubling the conversion speed. At the same time, he had to constantly divert his attention to avoid Nidhogg's attacks. Now's the time. Alaz gestured to her partner and Flora understood. The two of them came to Cyril's side, one on the left and one on the right. Scarlet walked over step by step with the holy spear in her hand, and Ovina stood by her side. On the holy spear in her hand, countless complex and mysterious patterns lit up one by one, and the majestic power seemed to pierce through the air, further intensifying the shaking of the Emerald Peak. Cracks appeared above the valley. As the earth quaked and the mountains swayed, the edges of the valley crumbled and fell into the darkness. The Shire came to Yuta's side and used a spell to teleport the mercenary leader away. Brando also grabbed Amandina's hand in a flash. Amandina, who had been hiding in the corner, looked at him with a pale face. Brando only smiled at her. Then he activated the law of space, and in a flash of silver light, Amandina's figure gradually disappeared. A flame surged from behind him and Nidhogg finally used his second element, the most powerful element, fire. Unfortunately, Brando held the golden flame sacred sword, which made him immune to all fire damage in the mortal world. He slowly turned his head and faced the Emerald Dragon herself. When the last rune in Scarlet's hand became unbelievably bright, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky and landed on her body. The power of thunder seemed to have broken through the barrier of the world, arrived in this lower world and melded into her blood. The power of the thunder god's blood had awakened. The power of the golden apple had also awakened. Her eyes seemed to be lit up by thunderbolts, and a golden flame was burning fiercely inside. Countless lightning bolts shot out from her body, forming bright lightning runes. In the midst of the interweaving lightning, the Highlander girl finally remembered her other name, the Oracle of Thunder. Ovina looked at her silently, and then took a step forward and melded into Scarlet's body. At that moment, Scarlet seemed to hear a gentle voice. Scarlet, remember to be brave and chase after everything, because wind and thunder are the most free and wild products in this world. Miss Ovina? Farewell. The last seal on the holy spear shattered, and turned into specks of light that dissipated into the air. Scarlet turned around and looked at Cyril coldly. The king of the Nangs finally sensed that something was wrong, but before he could react, a gigantic polar plane was born. In an instant, Alaz, Cyril, Scarlet, Irene and Flora all disappeared. When Cyril disappeared, Estoni reacted. He roared and threw a punch at the Shire who was summoning the polar plane. Unfortunately, the young wizard servant was unmoved, because the centipede of death had already emerged from the ground and was curling towards the giant's arm. Fyeth also summoned her card filter, the Silver Nightingale. Every time the Silver Nightingale attacked, the planeswalker would grab a card. The knowledge of the Bugas comes from their eyes and ears. Under the cover of many archangels, the Silver Nightingale successfully found the card that the fairy wanted the most. Then she showed him the card. Naturally, it fell silent. The creatures on the field couldn't attack for one round. The planeswalker's power restrained Estoni in an instant, and countless vines surged out from the ground and wrapped around the crystal monster. But the power of chaos wasn't a law within Tiamat, so it resisted in an instant. In just a moment, the vines wrapped around Estoni's hand shattered. However, this short delay was already enough. The Shire's polar plane was fully opened. Medisha stood up as well, and silver lines of law extended from behind her, connecting with Andrique and Mephistopheles. The countless lines of law became dazzling and bright, and intertwined to form a pale, gray spiritual world. Wherever this world passed, the crystal cluster fragments all disappeared without a trace. Estoni saw this and prepared to retreat, but Ropar was already waiting in that direction. Golden flames swept forward, connecting with the Shire's pale blue enchantment. Wind and fire, time and space, soul and nature. Everyone floated into the air, and the many polar planes connected with each other by their minds, forming a huge sphere that surrounded the crystal cluster tyrant. The Shire turned around and nodded at Brando. The next moment, the polar planes suddenly shrank into a silver dot of light and disappeared from this world. In an instant, Brando was the only one left on the falling verdant peak. And in front of him, the verdant dragon was striding forward with its head held high, and the valley was gone. In the eyes of the king of the Bronze tribe, the little bug in front of it had nowhere to run. But Brando didn't plan to run anymore, and he raised his head. A bright light gradually appeared behind him. It was the resonance of time and space. Chapter 1547. The golden-red sky was beginning to darken. Inside the room, the candles flickered and shook from time to time, shaking off the dust from the ceiling. After a long silence, Delphian finally spoke. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm afraid." Mithril looked at the Prime Minister's daughter without saying a word. Delphian smiled gently. "Aren't you going to ask why?" "I'm just worried about you," the Silver Dragon Lady said softly. "You care about Mr. Brando, so why are you staying here alone?" Delphian was silent for a moment, then turned her head to look at the scenery outside the window. The golden-red sky reflected a thin layer of light on her face, and her purple eyes seemed to reflect a glimmer of light. "Because what I'm afraid of is honesty, Mithril." Delphian turned around and smiled lightly. "Honesty is like a sharp knife, making me afraid to take a step forward." That day he nodded and smiled at me in the crowd. The crown in his hand was like a mockery to me. But I just wanted to tell him that what I wanted to see was his face when his lies were exposed. Crystal tears fell from the Prime Minister's daughter's face. She pursed her lips, which were slightly moist. She put on some light makeup, making her look even more dignified and beautiful than usual. Why is he always so arrogant? He'd rather walk down this path than bow down to me. I wish I could stop him, but my pride doesn't allow me to say anything. Delphian, the Silver Dragon Lady looked at the girl quietly and said, "Yes, you're always not honest enough, but that's what makes you unique. What you really need to do is to understand others. You should understand that Mr. Brando chose this path for a more noble reason." Delphian smiled and wiped the corners of her eyes. "Perhaps I fell in love with someone I shouldn't have," she said softly. "This is my perfect revenge, but the sharp dagger stabbed into my own heart." She stood up softly and walked past the Silver Dragon Lady. "Where are you going?" Mithril turned to look at her. Delphian stopped, turned around and smiled. "I want to be his queen." With these words, she quietly walked out of the room. Brando knew that he did not have much time. It was a fleeting moment, and he could only and must seize the opportunity to kill the king of the world, the eternal dragon Nidhogg. That would be a feat that no one in the other world could accomplish. However, he wasn't excited at all. The silver lines of law were behind him, extending under his feet. The power of space and time isolated everything, forming a huge network. The entire Emerald Summit disappeared. There were no more collapsed valleys, no more light, and no more darkness. There was only a void between him and the giant emerald dragon. Countless silver lines intertwined with each other, as if they formed the entire world. It was flowing time and space that overlapped with each other. It was the universe itself. The laws that represented the strings of time and space locked onto everything in the world. Any flowing and uncertain things became clear here. There were no more false things in the world, only the purest of laws. Countless laws were like brilliant stars hanging in the sky. And every light was closely connected to the laws of Tiamat and the world itself. The axis that represented time locked onto the emerald dragon that existed at any moment. Its so-called eternity was condensed into a point in this world that was only limited by laws, and it was no longer free. And every plane of space restricted Nidhogg's existence to travel through any parallel world. Its so-called eternity collapsed into a flat surface under Brando's instructions, superimposed on a thin piece of paper. The silver plane continued to shrink, and finally two light spots overlapped each other. The verdant dragon's almost infinite existence was combined into one at this moment. Perhaps in all the worlds, in all the history, this moment was the closest this emerald dragon was to a limited state. In a silent space, a man and a dragon confronted each other in the world formed by the overlapping points. The strength of the two was so close that Brando's power of laws was almost exhausted at this moment. Time infinitely approached a standstill. Brando knew that when this moment came, it would be his only chance to make a move. He would only have one chance. But his mind fell into an anxious cycle. Nidhogg's existence was locked in the next moment, and even in the next moment, even if it was just a microsecond, it would be restored to eternity. Then what method should he use to completely erase Nidhogg's existence in the most basic unit of time? That was a power that even the Holy Sword could not possess. Brando thought about his method. In order to think, he kept extending the line of time, making time almost eternally stop at this moment. The man and the dragon were in a deadlock in this state of stagnation. He didn't have absolute confidence and Nidhogg couldn't move. But time was always limited. The needle would always move again. His power of laws was getting closer and closer to exhaustion. Brando's eyes became complicated. Should he take a gamble? He closed his eyes slightly as if he had made the final decision in his mind. But at this moment, a voice struck his heartstrings. "Have you forgotten me, this vicious woman?" Brando was slightly stunned. Within his law of time, only his planeswalkers and creatures summoned by his cards of fate would be able to maintain the same flow of time as him, because they were considered to be one with him. But who was that voice? It couldn't be Medisha, nor could it be Hippamera or Andrique. A door of light opened in the darkness. A woman's slim figure slowly stepped out from it. The woman gently looked at Brando. She was wearing a black gauze dress and a veil, but even with the butterfly-shaped black mask on her face, her pair of purple eyes flashed with the light of wisdom. One could still see the calm and stubborn gaze of the Prime Minister's daughter. Was Delphian? No, perhaps it should be the unapproachable Fergie. Delphian? Did you not expect me to come here, Your Majesty? The Prime Minister's daughter asked with a smile. No, I am your planeswalker creature, Delphian said softly. As a part of the law, responding to your summons is normal, isn't it? But, Brando took a deep breath, you didn't really become a planeswalker and join the Dead Moon deck. So what? In the infinite still time, Delphian chuckled. She laughed so hard that her body shook. But her purple eyes maintained a trace of clarity and she gently replied, as long as I can help you, isn't that enough? She came to Brando's side and used her black gauze glove to gently lift Brando's chin. Her deep eyes quietly looked at Brando. Don't feel like you owe me because I hate it when you treat me like that. I understand why you didn't bring me, Brando finally spoke. You can't go, Delphian. I have other ways. What if you sacrifice someone else, such as the Silver Elf Princess? Brando was silent. The Prime Minister's daughter slightly lowered her head. As expected in your heart, I am far inferior to your little princess. No, that's not what I meant, Brando replied. But you can't be considered a real planeswalker creature. I can. Is it too late now? Delphian looked at him with a smile. She stretched out a finger and gently tapped Brando's chest. You can't move any more, right? Brando was stunned and stared blankly at the Prime Minister's daughter. Do you regret it? Delphian asked softly. Regret that you were soft-hearted and didn't turn me into a real card creature? She smiled slightly, but it's not a big deal. I want you to remember I am your queen. The Prime Minister's daughter gently lowered her head and her purple lips kissed Brando's lips. Then she looked up, turned around and slowly walked towards the Emerald Dragon. Brando could only silently watch the Prime Minister's daughter's back. At this moment, whether he let go of time or not, it seemed that he was destined to be unable to change the outcome. In the void, Nidhogg was like a continuous mountain range, and the Prime Minister's daughter was like a speck of dust next to him. She turned around and looked at Brando one last time. In that moment, all love and hatred were meaningless. In the girl's eyes, there was only tenderness and affection. She gently placed her hand on Nidhogg's body. The Planeswalker's law displayed its absolute majesty on the creatures in the Tiamat network. Whenever the unapproachable Fergie causes battle damage to a creature, kill that creature. In the deep space, a long mournful howl sounded. But when time began to flow again, a legend of immortality and eternity ended at this moment. It was like the end of a cycle. Energy and matter, everything that made up the Bronze King, endlessly radiated in all directions, bursting into the void. In the endless white light, the lighthouse of the dark world, the peak of Emerald, collapsed. The whole kingdom of the dead seemed to be bathed in a pure white light. Countless energy, like a huge ring, slowly spread out from the sky. Everything disappeared, except for Brando, who was firmly protected by the law of space. Not far from him was the black altar. In the light, a small object flew out. Brando caught it subconsciously. It was a remnant of a brooch. On it was a purple poppy flower. On the back of the mithril surface, a line of small words was engraved: Gift to Delphian. Mithril Terraris. Brendo looked at the brooch in his hand and blinked his eyes. In this world of nothingness, some sand got into his eyes. He pursed his lips and took a deep breath. Before turning around, Brando took one last look at the center of the white light. In that pure and flawless light, it seemed that the heart of a young girl was peacefully sleeping. Then he turned around and walked into the door of light without hesitation. There. It would be the beginning of everything and also the place where everything would end. In the darkness and void, there was a faint roar. White Tiamat suddenly raised her head as if she had suddenly awakened. She looked at the hourglass floating in the darkness not far away. The golden sand quietly flowed. It was already at this time, but the ghost of the princess seemed to have reacted. She woke up from the darkness, a deep light reflected in her eyes. In the distance there seemed to be a meteor streaking across. In response, among the rows of petri dishes in her field of vision, one of them became bright. The first one. Tiamat looked at this scene and said indifferently. She raised her hand and gently stroked the hair on her forehead. Her silver eyes flashed with a complicated brilliance. The dark world was immersed in a silent tranquility. But this was the last piece. The void was trembling. Tiamat picked up an upside-down picture frame on the table. She turned the picture frame over, and on the rough drawing paper, there were 4 smiling faces drawn with simple pen and ink. And one of them was so blurry that it was almost invisible. Tiamat gently stroked the man's face. Tears streamed down her face and drifted away in the darkness. Villefort, I hope you can forgive me. Tiamat's gaze swept over her 2 daughters, and became gentle and peaceful. But in the end she put down the picture frame and raised her head. It has begun. In the void of Bunasan, witches from the 13 countries, each led by a witch from the moon of heritage, came to the border of their countries. The stars in the sky seemed to reflect the light of an era. Sophie raised her head and stared at the silver wolf in the distance. Ekka's gaze was cold and somewhat anxious. It's time, the giant wolf's voice echoed in the void. Sophie, why can't I really control the power of the law of Tiamat? Where is the throne of destiny? But Sophie just smiled softly. I don't know. What did you say? An angry howl resounded throughout the elemental border. But in the darkness, Tiamat had already revealed herself. She was silently watching this ancient battle. Behind her, in a long time ago, there was a place that had been given a special name, Gaia. The purpose of the Earth's existence was to protect the birth of life. And that was where all hope lay. Chapter 1548. The world behind the light gate was actually a world of water. The water surface was as calm as a mirror, like a shallow sea. The surface of the sea reflected the brilliant starry sky. A meteor streaked across the distant sky, and the shallow clouds outlined the horizon like a mountain. Brando's toes lightly stepped on the surface of the water, and circles of ripples spread out on the mirror surface. That was the place where everything was born. Light traveled on the surface of the water, and spirits were born from the water. He raised his head. The back of the girl in the distance was motionlessly looking up at the bright starry sky. You came later than I thought. She slowly turned around, and her bright black eyes gazed at Brando as she spoke softly. Between the two of them was a throne. It was as blue as the sea, and the stars could compose poems on it. It was pure and flawless like Martha's crown. On the plateau of Karsuk, the sun was slowly sinking into the horizon. Everyone raised their heads to look at the night sky that was destined to be extraordinary in Wonde. Half of the sky seemed to be burning with golden flames, and the layers of clouds reflected the fiery red light. The burning meteor streaked across the sky bit by bit. On the other half of the sky, the stars had just risen, and those majestic, bright and magnificent constellations were revealed one by one on the light purple sky. The stars were changing their light, and in the night sky, the constellation of a king was gradually appearing in everyone's vision. That was a marvel that had existed for countless years. The clouds and stars in the night sky were changing with each other, forming a towering mountain. A huge dragon that spanned across the sky and the king on the mountain peak were looking at each other. At this moment in everyone's eyes, there were such stars and dreams, flames and death. It was the most magnificent scene written in the history of the Pale poem. The Twilight Dragon had merged with the law of Tiamat at this moment. And a voice resounded in the sky at that moment. "You came a little later than I expected, Brendel, but it's all over," the Roman said softly. She stretched out her hand and a pure and flawless light shone from her palm. The light flowed slowly like a silent poem, describing the story of several eras. In countless myths and legends, it had many names. Pale Poem, Black Prophecy, Martha's Authority, as well as the Throne of Destiny. The Roman gazed at the bright light and said, "Look, this is what you have been relying on, the Throne of Destiny, and it now belongs to me." She raised her head and admired the magnificent starry sky. Her eyes reflected the colorful light as if she was intoxicated. "I will witness your world's destruction in the flames with my own eyes. Such a magnificent starry sky will eventually dissipate into the endless darkness. When the stars extinguish one by one, the universe will welcome eternal silence. Don't you think it's beautiful, Brando?" She laughed softly, "Because the truth is always beautiful. Do you still remember the stars we saw in the summer night in Bucci? Although it's a pity they will eventually die." Brando looked at her quietly. For a moment, he really saw the shadow of the merchant lady in her. But unfortunately, a shadow will always be a shadow. He sighed. The Roman looked back at him. "Why are you sighing? Are you feeling sorry for all of this?" Brando shook his head. "What I'm sighing about is the time that will never return. It lingers in my heart, always reminding me of the good things that have passed away. But what has passed away will always pass away. What has passed away will always pass away." Amandina raised her head in the snow-covered forest, listening to the familiar and gentle voice. In the sky, it slowly sounded as if it was telling an ancient story. In that story she was the princess in the fairy tale, and her prince opened the long and narrow door with warm light for her. That was her heart. At some point, Amandina covered her mouth, tears rolling down, sprinkling on the white snowflakes. Brando slowly raised his head, looked into the Roman's eyes and said quietly, "I just want to tell you something, Twilight Dragon." "You're wrong." He reached out his hand. In the darkness, two extended golden lines appeared in his hand. The lines outlined the shape of a holy sword. The distinct blade shone with the light of resistance. Holy sword Odorfice, little by little, reflected on the surface of the water. Bright stars seemed to rise in the night sky. In every land on the continent of Wonde, people looked at this scene in a daze. 7 holy swords shone in the night sky. Odorfice, that represented the flame of resistance. Cinna, the radiance of wisdom. Judgment, selfless justice. Verdant, the life of nature. Firmament, unrestrained freedom. Haurangaya, the silent protection. Mithra, the pure faith. The 7 rays of light disappeared one by one. But the 7 stars that rose gradually merged into one and turned into a new constellation under people's gazes. Many years later, people could still remember this night, the constellation that shone in the night sky. It was a bright sword. It had a name. It was called Destiny. Brando held the sword and stood on the reflection of the shallow sea. On the blade, the 7 holy swords, water and fire, wind and earth, life and light and darkness, disappeared one by one behind him. They merged into one and turned into a flawless sharp blade that emitted golden light. It was resplendent like a golden crystal. And in the crystal, it contained the destiny of this world. Roman was stunned. She clearly felt an ominous threat from the sword and asked in a low voice, "What is that?" She was slightly stunned. "Why do I feel the same power as the throne of destiny from that sword? But this is impossible. In the law of Tiamat, there can't be two identical authorities. But Brando just looked at the Twilight Dragon quietly. This is Amber, he replied softly. His soft voice seemed to describe all the legends of this sword. Amber? The Twilight Dragon frowned in confusion. But Brando raised the sword in his hand. The transparent sword body seemed to contain some invisible power. His focused eyes stood opposite the Twilight Dragon across the throne, but there seemed to be an insurmountable gap between the two. Did you see? The trajectory in this sword is like the destiny of mortals. Because amber is originally a container used to hold time and history. When destiny is placed in it, everything is fixed here. Brando raised his head and answered her seriously. In the law of Tiamat, there are indeed no two identical authorities, but the crown in your hand is power, and the crown in my hand is responsibility. The Twilight Dragon finally felt that something was wrong. She took a step back and asked, "What's the difference?" Brando laughed. It was as if in countless wars over the ages, the side of order had never been so close to the dawn of victory as at this moment. He softly answered the truth. The meaning of Amber's existence is not to be in charge of everything. However, there was a type of power that wasn't the supreme ruler. Instead, it was a power that placed authority in the hands of every single mortal. Amber was a shackle. And the meaning of the shackle's existence is that it can be broken by people. That was the sonorous and forceful reply that resounded above the clouds at this moment. In the mountains of Alkash, the little princess from Nine Phoenix silently lowered her head, looked at the gloves in her hands and listened to her teacher's words. It was a promise, but it was also a declaration. Do you still not understand, Twilight Dragon? Brendel's voice seemed to carry a faint sense of pride. If from this moment onwards, the law of Tiamat no longer exists in this world, what do you think will happen? What will happen? At that moment, on Babel Fortress, the female Legion commander actually shed tears in a daze. The memory of the young man in the loop of trade winds became clear and blurry at the same time. The distance between them was so far away. And Vahina was already sobbing silently. Mephisto, who was beside them, patted their shoulders without saying a word. Under the brilliant starry sky, Brando gently raised the sword in his hand. He softly recited, "Lady Martha, I wear the crown on my head and bear its weight. With the holy sword in my hand, I swear to cut off all the shackles, and the cycle of history will end at this moment. Everything I promised you to do is now here." On the plateau, the starry sky seemed to have changed. Above the star, at the peak of the mountains, a monarch stood tall and slowly received a crown from the clouds. That was a kind promise, the authority of the highest. From Karsuk to Tanajul, from the wilderness of the Four Territories to Cloak Bay, from the White Mountain to the Great Plains, people looked up at the sky and actually knelt down one by one. In the starry sky, as if a river of stars stretched across the sky, that was the King of Wond, fulfilling his promise. Mithril stared blankly at the starry sky outside the window. And in the tree hall, Haruz looked at the crown in his hand. Crystal clear tears fell on Erwin's gem drop by drop. Brando's voice finally revealed a hint of relief. "Dusk?" He raised his head and smiled. "Are you ready?" "No." The Roman screamed. She finally realized what Brando was going to do and shouted in panic, "No, you can't kill me. You have to understand that my body is not here. At most, you can only kill a part of my consciousness." But Brando shook his head. "If you don't become one with the law of Tiamat, how can you destroy this world? Twilight Dragon, why deceive yourself? The moment you get the throne of destiny, you are Tiamat." "You," the merchant girl finally panicked. "You have been waiting for the moment I get the throne of destiny. You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Brando nodded silently. "No." The Roman screamed. "The moment you put on this crown, you are also Tiamat. If you completely break this chain, it is equivalent to suicide. Don't you understand? You will die too." But Brando just looked at her unmoved. At that moment, the Roman suddenly understood something. She looked shaken. "Okay, I admit that you have won. Let me leave this place. I promise to give you another era. Everyone will live. You, your family, friends, and even everything in this world." She shouted almost hysterically. "Isn't that enough?" Brando shook his head. "No." The merchant girl felt like she was going crazy. She screamed. "There is also myself. I have a part of the Roman in me, don't I? Are you going to kill her too?" There was a hint of softness in Brando's eyes, but there was a glimmer of light in his tears. "I'm sorry, Roman." He replied softly. "What I want is not a part of you but all of you." Along with the gentle words, the King of Wond raised the holy sword in his hand resolutely. He took a step forward and slashed at the throne in the middle of the shallow sea. That slash would be the most dazzling sword light in this world. Because what it was breaking free from was not only the fate of this world. In the void, there seemed to be the sound of everything shattering. Allium Japonicum looked up at the sky in a daze. In the layers of clouds, a king was carrying a pair of wings of light. It was as dazzling as ever. He gently put the crown on his head and slowly sat down on the throne. He was so majestic looking at this land. His knights seemed to be expanding this vast land for him. His gaze had long since focused on a place even further away. In the distant sky, there was a soft and gentle song between the layers of clouds. A gentle voice was currently speaking to him. I give you wings of light. And one day I will be proud of you, my child. The burning clouds faded away layer by layer. The silver network was flickering and collapsing in the sky above Wonde. The magic circles and mysterious runes that surrounded the wizards suddenly disappeared one by one. They gradually lost their magic ability. The power of the elements also faded away layer by layer. The lines of the laws no longer flashed in the world. The world constructed by the elements at this moment settled into a real cornerstone. The evening wind gently blew on the plateau. The sunset was fading away. Tolman suddenly raised his hand. There was a striking wound on his wrist. Bright red blood was slowly flowing out. An era had ended. The golden eye in the sky was slowly closing. A world's wail resounded across the entire land. Dusk had fallen. Just like its descent, the war that had lasted for 7 eras had come to an end at this moment. Looking around on the plains of Wonde, the crystal cluster and the no race were falling down one by one. All of a sudden, the lofty lord of the crystal clusters disintegrated and turned into fragments that flew with the wind. And the sobbing sound spread across the plateau. Behind Allium Japonicum, Maynard actually knelt on the ground in a daze. Senior touched her cheeks. She didn't know when, but her face was also full of tears. On the battlefield, Freya quietly watched everything. Her eyes were filled with a peaceful look. Beside her, Erwin's silver lily flag fluttered gently in the wind of the plateau. But her tears fell into the dust. She raised her head. What he saw was like a starry summer night, a brilliant Milky Way stretched across the Bucci Mountains. That day, Petit Finus was still beside her. Big sister, do you hear that voice? Perhaps that was the beginning of everything. Time passed in the darkness. Sophie? A somewhat unfamiliar voice came from behind Brando. Brando was stunned and turned around. He saw a few knights wearing the knight's uniform of Grecius walking towards him. They patted his shoulder and said, "What are you waiting for? The undead are coming." Undead? Brando was stunned. He raised his head. In front of him was the mountains of Alcash. The flags that covered the mountains were countless Fanzan Knights regiment. The knights were making their final preparations. They walked out of the fortifications and lined up in the open valley. The knights walked past him one by one. Suddenly he remembered the name of one of the knights. But the light and shadow in front of him suddenly intertwined. Then it turned into a sky full of flames. A player covered in blood hurried to him and shouted, "Run, Madara is attacking." In the smoke and dust, Erwin's silver lily flag was slowly falling. As far as the eye could see, palaces and cities were burned to ashes in the flames. Brando didn't know when, but tears were streaming down his face. But the scene in front of him changed again. He was released and stood on a vast battlefield. Everywhere he looked, there were burning embers and remnants of corpses. The remains of chariots and tanks were burning and scattered across the open plains. Above his head, countless flying machines were whistling and flying into the distance. In the sky there was a giant dragon that covered the sky. Its huge golden eyes stared coldly at the earth. Countless soldiers were passing by him. It was as if they did not see his existence as they shouted and charged into the distance. Then all the light disappeared. The world seemed to return to darkness. In the endless darkness, he heard a gentle voice. "This is your last hope. I hope you cherish it." Author's note: after this chapter there should be one last chapter. The last chapter still needs to be edited. It will probably take about an hour before it will be released. It will give everyone a more satisfactory ending. After all, I said that I wouldn't write a tragedy. After the book is finished, I should write the afterword of Amber. I don't know if it will be published today or tomorrow. Also, I wish everyone a happy new year. I am very grateful for your 6 years of companionship. Chapter 1549. A long spear pierced straight into Cyril's chest. Scarlet gasped for air. She gripped the spear tightly and stared at the king of the No tribe as he wailed and turned into countless pieces that dissipated from the world. She turned her head around. Above the vast extreme plains there was only a void left. In the distant, deep darkness, a sky-blue figure was gradually moving further and further away from her. Miss Ovina. My lord. In the darkness, the Highlander girl suddenly woke up. Soft sunlight shone into the room through the window. The thin curtains could not hide the beauty of summer. On the desk there was a warm lily. Scarlet suddenly realized that she had a nightmare. She sat on the bed and gently placed her hand on her chest. Everything in the past flowed gently in her heart. She looked up and looked at the azure spear on the side of the room peacefully. The sound of Hippamera and Sheeta fighting could be heard from the courtyard outside, accompanied by Maynard's scolding. Outside the window the sky was blue and clear. The carriage slowly drove into the forest. Dilfrey held the letter in her hand and silently stared in that direction until the shadow of the carriage finally disappeared. She looked down at the letter in her hand. In her bright eyes, there was a flash of relief, and then she turned around with light steps. In the Yenbao manor, the servants were discussing the kingdom's annual grand wedding in whispers. What happened after that? After that everything was fine. His Majesty the Flame King cut off the head of the Twilight Dragon, and the war of our time came to an end. What does this have to do with the princess wedding? Of course it has to do with it. Princess Foza also participated in that war, but the story I heard is different from yours. Didn't His Majesty the Flame King leave our world? That's just a rumor from the countryside. Dilfrey smiled. She looked up at the clouds in the sky. The sea breeze blew gently, and the letter in her hand seemed to flutter. On the letter there was a seal of black pine. A young man walked on the main road of Abes. He had an unshaven beard and wore a tattered straw hat. He held a blade of grass in his mouth and looked around curiously. The wide streets on both sides of Coldwood Castle had changed drastically. There were new buildings on both sides of the road, all kinds of magical workshops. Steam was roaring, and on the green belt, there were iron lampposts with the royal family's lily emblem hanging on them. The passers-by on the street had never seen such a shabbily dressed person since the silver year of the first epoch. They all looked at the young man. The young man did not notice and stopped one of them and asked, "Brother, may I ask what year is it this year?" "Which year? I mean, how long has it been since the year of the sword?" The man looked at the young man as if he was a lunatic. "This is the second era, the year of the summer wild. It has been 12 years since the year of the sword." He patted the young man's shoulder. "Young man, don't drink too much." Carglass did not know whether to laugh or cry. He did not expect that it would take him 12 years to return to this world after being banished by All for One. The most important thing was that everything here was different from the Erewhon he knew. The lords were gone, the kingdom had 3 new provinces in the Black Forest, the royal faction had disbanded 10 years ago, and the war was over. The locals of Tanajul were actually drunkards. He sighed softly, feeling a little melancholy in his heart. "Erewhon still exists, but where are you, my lord?" He grabbed the man's arm and took out a silver coin from his pocket. "What is the date today? What is the celebration?" Carglass pointed at the 2 sides of the street that were decorated with lanterns and decorations. There were also curtains with lily emblems on them. In the distance there were even tables with beer barrels and food on them. The whole of Abes Castle was filled with a festive atmosphere. "Don't you know, buddy? This is the wedding of Her Royal Highness." "The wedding of Her Royal Highness?" Carglass was shocked. "Princess Griffin is getting married? Who is she marrying?" "What Princess Griffin?" The man snapped. "Her Royal Highness passed away a few years ago." "Watch your mouth, young man. The one getting married is Princess Focia." "The Royal Highness passed away? The one getting married is Princess Focia?" Carglass was dumbfounded as he watched the man walk away. Who was Princess Focia? He walked into the central square of Abes Castle in a daze. Under the bright sunlight he finally saw the towering statue. Carglass stopped in his tracks. Tears immediately flowed out of his eyes. He finally recognized the most eye-catching statue of a knight in the square. It was the person he revered. His lord. He stood under the statue in a daze until someone came to his side and stood next to him. That person also raised his head to look at the statue. After a while the person spoke. "It has been many years. The number of people who would stand under this statue is getting fewer and fewer." When Carglass heard the familiar voice, he turned around abruptly. "Mr. Reto? Carglass?" The tall arched window, bright colors, and the courtyard outside the window was as beautiful as ever. It was as if in the past 10 years, this somewhat quiet study had not changed much since the year her father had passed away. Griffin quietly looked at the long chair under the curtains. The red cushion on the chair reflected the golden afternoon sun. Dust flew up and down in the slanted beams of sunlight. Griffin could still remember a girl sitting on this chair, listening to the story told by Oberway in the same quiet afternoon. The eldest princess slowly blinked her eyes. She gathered her thoughts and gently closed the door before turning around to leave. But a voice called out to her from behind. Sister. Haruz, with a crown on his head, looked at his sister's slender and lonely back. After 10 years he had grown up and had the responsibility of a king. But there were still some things in his heart that he could not let go. Call me Princess Griffin. Sister, Haruz could not help but whisper, send my regards to teacher. Griffin turned her head and looked at her brother. Griffin had a faint smile on her face. Why don't you go by yourself? Teacher doesn't want to see me, is that so? Griffin's eyes flashed with a mischievous light. Speaking of which, I married him in your place. Sister, Haruz suddenly felt embarrassed. Can you stop talking about Princess Fuchsia? I didn't do it on purpose. It's okay, Griffin smiled happily. She will be mine in the future. Naturally, she has nothing to do with you. Haruz looked at his sister with a dumbfounded expression. The hall of Abi's castle was filled with laughter and discussion from time to time. Everyone was preparing for the upcoming wedding, Viscount Canelin and Princess Fuchsia's wedding. Perhaps half a year ago, Erwin never knew where Canelin was in this kingdom. Perhaps it was a newly cultivated land in the Black Forest. A brave knight won the heart of the princess. Everything was just like the legend from 10 years ago. But amidst the harmony, there were always some discordant notes. For example, there was a voice that sounded a little angry. This account is wrong again, Amandina. Where's Falern? Go get Falern. Amandina smiled bitterly as she looked at the merchant lady with her hands on her hips and raised eyebrows in front of her. Falern has already gone on a trip to the plains with Mr. the Shire. They also brought Tia with them. Oh, the angry merchant lady knocked on her head. I remember now, this account is managed by that fellow. She looked up and saw a sneaky figure going up the stairs. She immediately shouted, Brando, stop right there. But there was no way Brendel would stop, and he immediately ran away. Amandina's angry voice could be heard throughout the castle. Brando, you're dead. Did you climb into that little female dragon's bed again yesterday? Or Scarlet? Or those two little she-wolves? The Highlander girl was about to go out, but when she heard this, her face immediately turned red. She opened the door and saw a certain lord winking at her from outside. Scarlet was stunned for a moment, then silently closed the door. Anyway, Amandina's voice came from outside. I'm telling you, Brando, you can sleep with anyone you want, but you can't recklessly calculate accounts. If you make such a low-level mistake again, I'll kick you out of my guild. In the garden, Mephistopheles was overjoyed as he listened to the commotion in the castle. He looked at his sister. Andrique looked in that direction in annoyance and replied, a pair of dogs. The silver elf princess who was sitting at the side listened to Andrique's complaints and couldn't help but smile. She raised her head and looked at the mottled shade of the trees. She suddenly felt an unprecedented peace in her heart. In the cemetery, Edessa quietly looked at the quiet and lonely tombstone in the midst of the rose bushes. Her gaze was soft, as if she was recalling everything from many years ago. In that chaotic era, her soul was able to find someone to rely on. But in this era she could only feel lonely in this world. She stopped in front of the tombstone for a while, just like every afternoon she would stop here. To her, in this lonely cemetery, there was a king buried in her heart. She silently held the necklace in her hand. On the necklace, there was only a crystal pendant missing. That was all her hope. Edessa slowly turned around and walked out of the cemetery. At this moment, she heard an astonished cry from behind her. Maria. Edessa turned around and saw a girl who she had seen several times in the corner of the cemetery. She was dumbfounded as she looked at the young man standing in front of her. The girl's beautiful face was full of tears. Carglass, you're still alive? The two of them hugged each other tightly. Seeing this, Edessa suddenly understood what had happened. She gently pressed her hand on her chest and felt a slight warmth in her heart. She looked at the flashing forest in the distance and seemed to have made a decision in her heart. She raised her head and strode out of the cemetery. After that, no one saw this lady in the Abbes again. It was not until many years later that a beautiful legend spread in the southern territory of Erewhon. In that legend, a nun of the Javier Silver Lily Association dedicated her life to those who were blind. In the quiet forest in the afternoon, Brando finally escaped from the Abbes castle. He held the letter in his hand and strolled alone in the sunny forest. This forest once carried many of his beautiful memories. Those memories, with the accumulation of years, became more and more mellow and unique. He raised the letter in his hand. It was a congratulatory letter from Faina. The letter complained that he had not visited her for so long. But more than that, this mature lady described everything about the new Kurlutz. After Prince Leneret succeeded to the throne, the empire gained a new lease of life that had been silent for a long time, and everything gradually got on the right track. People gradually forgot the pain of the past and began to rebuild their homes on the ruins after the battlefield. At the end of the letter, Faina once again urged him to hurry to the empire to see her. As soon as he thought of the princess of Mehodafen, Brando could not help but smile. He put the letter in his arms and let out a long breath. After the Battle of Dusk, everything returned to its original state. Phoenix's flames were in the 9 Phoenix, and his senior sister had also traveled around the world. Occasionally she would send him some local specialties. And the world seemed to have changed. Although there were still some monsters and remnants of the Dusk at the border of civilization, but after the death of the Dusk Dragon, everything was at least moving in the best direction. In the hearts of the people, the Flame King had died. But as a mortal he managed to survive. After losing all his power, there did not seem to be any discomfort, but Brando had always had a vague regret in his heart. He silently took out the wrinkled card from his arms. On the card there was a painting of a lady wearing a black dress and a mask. The card was so old that it had lost all its magic, but he looked at the piece of paper in a daze and said softly, "The king is not dead, but you went to escape alone?" There was a rustling sound in the forest as if responding to his voice. But suddenly, as if it was an illusion, a laughing voice suddenly sounded behind him. "Speaking ill of others behind their backs, this is not what a king should do." Brando's hand trembled slightly, and the piece of paper fell to the ground. He turned his head back in a daze. Under the pale yellow and mottled sunlight, between the light and shadow, it was the rational and arrogant girl. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to still be wearing the long dress she had worn when she left that day. She calmly looked at him, her purple eyes flashing with a light that he had not seen for a long time. But unknowingly those eyes were filled with tears. Suddenly, a figure threw herself into his arms. "I'm back, Brando." Brando had been stunned for a long time. He looked up, his eyes flashing with the most grateful light. "Thank you, Tiamas. To be able to meet each other is the best hope of people." The end of the book. Chapter 1550. A lot of people said that they didn't see the work related, so I'll post another one. The new book Pillars of Ida had been uploaded for almost a week and a half with 55,000 words. The theme of the new book was virtual online games, a team adventure novel, and the theme was more relaxed. Originally, when he wrote Amber, he planned to write a fantasy novel, but after thinking about it, in order to make up for Kanan's regret, he decided to write a more pure online game. Of course, it wasn't an online game in the traditional sense. After all, he had already written a lot of traditional online games. Overall, the new book could basically be regarded as a spiritual continuation of Kanan's work. The purpose of the story wouldn't be too different. It was still a story of exploration, teamwork, and adventure. Of course, after all, it was a new world, so naturally there would be a new beginning. From the beginning of adventure, from the end of adventure, I hope everyone likes it. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.